There is a photograph from the backstretch at Daytona International Speedway, taken on a February afternoon in 1979, that shows three men throwing punches in the grass beside two wrecked race cars. The image is grainy, shot from a distance, the kind of photograph that would be unremarkable if the three men in it were not among the most famous athletes in the history of stock car racing. Two of them are Bobby and Donnie Allison. The third, the one in the middle of the fight, the one who started it, the one who was not going to back down no matter how many Allisons were involved, is a 5'7", 150-pound fireplug from Timmonsville, South Carolina, named William Caleb Yarborough. The world knows him as Cale. And that fight on the Daytona backstretch, broadcast live into millions of American homes by CBS on a snowbound Sunday afternoon, is the image that most casual fans associate with his name. It should not be. Because that fight, as famous as it is, as important as it was for the growth of the sport, is a footnote in the story of one of the most ferocious competitors who ever lived. A man who won 83 Cup Series races, a man who won 4 Daytona 500s, a man who did something that no driver before him had done, and that only one driver after him would match. He won 3 consecutive Cup Series championships in 1976, 1977, and 1978. A streak of dominance so complete that it redefined what was possible in stock car racing. 3 consecutive championships. Think about what that means. In a sport where mechanical failure, a single crash, one bad pit stop, can unravel an entire season's worth of work, Cale Yarborough maintained championship-caliber consistency across 3 full seasons, 90 races, tens of thousands of miles, hundreds of hours behind the wheel at speeds that turned every weekend into a negotiation between glory and catastrophe. He did not merely win those championships. He dominated them, winning 28 races across the 3 seasons, finishing in the top 5 more than 50 times, producing a run of sustained excellence that has only one parallel in the sport's history. And he did it with a ferocity that bordered on the pathological. Cale Yarborough did not race. He attacked. He attacked the track. He attacked the competition. He attacked the limits of the car and the limits of physics and the limits of his own body with a disregard for self-preservation that terrified his competitors and electrified the fans. He was not the smoothest driver of his era. He was not the most technically precise. He was the most relentless. The man simply refused to be beaten, and the sheer force of his refusal carried him to victories and championships that drivers with more natural talent and more refined technique could not match. The stories about Cale Yarborough's toughness are the stuff of racing legend. He once wrestled an alligator. He played semi-professional football despite his small stature. He survived a crash at Daytona that sent his car barrel rolling through the infield at speeds that should have been fatal, climbed out of the wreckage, and asked when the next race was. He was bitten by a rattlesnake as a boy in the South Carolina Low Country, and, according to the version of the story he told most often, the snake died. Whether that particular detail is literally true is beside the point. The point is that Cale Yarborough was the kind of man about whom such stories were told, and the kind of man about whom such stories were believed. The numbers alone would place him among the sport's immortals. 83 victories, 70 career pole positions, 4 Daytona 500 wins, 3 consecutive championships. But Cale Yarborough was never a man who could be captured by numbers. He was a force, a presence, a small man with an enormous will who bent the sport to his ambitions through a combination of talent, determination, and an absolute refusal to accept any outcome other than victory. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand why Cale Yarborough's 3 consecutive championships represent one of the most remarkable achievements in the history of American motorsport. You are going to understand the era he dominated, the rivals he defeated, the partnership he forged with the legendary Jimmie Johnson, and the driving philosophy that made him one of the most feared competitors in any sport. You are going to understand the man behind the helmet, the son of a tobacco farmer who became a champion, the fighter who never stopped fighting, and the legacy he left behind when the engines finally went quiet. Before we get started, if you find these stories as moving as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more people who appreciate the legends of the game. Now let us begin. There are those who study the history of stock car racing and who construct their hierarchies of greatness based on the numbers alone, on the career victory totals and the championship tallies and the pole positions and the average finishes. By those measures, Cale Yarborough ranks among the finest drivers in the history of the sport. 83 career victories places him fourth on the all-time wins list, behind only Richard Petty, David Pearson and Bobby Allison. The 3 consecutive championships are a feat that only one other driver in history, Jimmie Johnson, has surpassed in terms of consecutive titles. The 4 Daytona 500 victories tie him with Jeff Gordon for the second most all-time, behind only Richard Petty's 7. But numbers, however impressive, are abstractions. They do not convey the heat of the cockpit, the scream of the engine, the G-forces in the turns, the split-second decisions that separate victory from catastrophe. They do not convey the character of the man behind the wheel, the relentless competitive fire, the absolute refusal to accept any outcome other than the one he intended, the willingness to push himself and his machine to limits that more cautious men would not approach. The numbers tell you what Cale Yarborough did. They do not tell you who he was. Who he was is the subject of this story, and who he was beneath the helmet and behind the wheel was one of the most extraordinary competitors who ever lived, in any sport, in any era. A man whose physical courage was matched only by his mental toughness, whose small stature concealed an enormous heart, and whose 3 consecutive championships represent an achievement that, properly understood, deserves to be mentioned alongside the greatest accomplishments in the history of American athletics. The trophies that line the shelves of his South Carolina home were not given. They were taken by a man who had no business being that fast, that tough, that relentless. Taken from a sport that did not yield its prizes to anyone who was not willing to fight for them with everything they had. Taken across 3 decades of competition that tested every dimension of his talent, his courage, and his will. The sport that produced Cale Yarborough was born in sin. That is not a moral judgment. It is a historical fact. Stock car racing in the American South did not emerge from country clubs or engineering laboratories or the offices of civic-minded entrepreneurs. It emerged from the red clay backroads of Appalachia and the Carolina Low Country, from the desperate ingenuity of men who made their living running illegal whiskey past federal agents in cars that had been modified to outrun anything the government could put on the road. The moonshine runners of the 1930s and 1940s were, in a very real sense, the first stock car racers. They took ordinary-looking automobiles, Ford coupes and Chevrolet sedans that could blend into civilian traffic without drawing attention, and they transformed them into high-performance machines capable of speeds that the factory engineers had never imagined. The modifications were practical, not aesthetic. Heavier springs to handle the weight of the whiskey jugs loaded into the trunk, larger engines bored out to produce more horsepower, improved brakes to navigate the mountain curves at speeds that would have been suicidal in a standard car. The goal was not to look fast. The goal was to be faster than the revenue agents who patrolled the backroads on moonlit nights, faster than the law, faster than the consequences of getting caught. The runners drove in darkness on roads that were unpaved and unlit, through mountain passes and along river bottoms and across county lines that might mean the difference between a fine and a prison sentence. They drove with their headlights off to avoid detection, navigating by memory and by the faint light of the moon, pushing their modified cars to speeds that the roads were never designed to accommodate. The skill required to survive this kind of driving, to maintain control of a heavily loaded car on a rutted dirt road at 80 or 90 miles per hour in the dark, was extraordinary, and the men who possessed it were, by the standards of any era, among the most talented drivers in the world. When the running was done, when the whiskey was delivered, and the money was collected, and the agents were nowhere to be found, the runners did what competitive men have always done. They argued about who was the fastest, and the arguments, as arguments among competitive men always do, eventually demanded a resolution. The resolution took the form of races, informal at first, held on weekends in cow pastures and empty fields, where the runners could settle their disputes and demonstrate their skills in front of audiences that were eager for entertainment and untroubled by the legal origins of the competitors' driving abilities. These informal races were the seeds from which stock car racing grew. The audiences grew, the organisation improved. The venues moved from cow pastures to rudimentary dirt tracks that were carved out of the landscape with bulldozers and bordered by wooden fences that offered minimal protection to the spectators who crowded against them. Promoters emerged, men who recognised that there was money to be made from the public's appetite for speed and danger, and who were willing to invest the effort required to organise events, attract competitors, and collect admission fees. In 1947, a former gas station owner and race promoter named William Henry Getty France, known to everyone as Bill France Sr., began to envision something larger. France had been promoting races on the Beach Road course at Daytona Beach, Florida, since the late 1930s, and he understood, better than anyone else in the loose-knit community of race promoters and drivers, that the sport needed organisation, standardisation, and a governing body that could enforce rules, settle disputes, and present a coherent product to the paying public. On December the 14th, 1947, France convened a meeting at the Streamline Hotel in Daytona Beach. The attendees were a collection of drivers, mechanics, promoters, and car owners, men whose hands were stained with grease, and whose pockets were lined with the modest profits of a sport that had not yet figured out how to be profitable. France laid out his vision, a national sanctioning body for stock car racing that would establish standardized rules, create a points system for determining a national champion, and provide the organizational framework that would allow the sport to grow beyond its regional origins. The organization was incorporated on February the 21st, 1948, under the name National Association for Stock Car Auto Racing, NASCAR. The name was functional and unpoetic, but the ambition behind it was enormous. Bill France Sr. was not content to preside over a regional curiosity. He intended to build a national sport, and the organization he created in that Daytona Beach hotel room was the instrument through which he would pursue that ambition for the next 3 decades. The early years of NASCAR were characterized by a rawness and a danger that modern fans would find almost incomprehensible. The tracks were primitive, many of them dirt ovals that turned into mud pits in the rain and dust bowls in the heat. The cars were barely modified street vehicles, heavy and unreliable, prone to mechanical failures that could strand a driver at any point during a race. The safety equipment was minimal, with drivers competing in open-face helmets, cotton uniforms, and street shoes, protected from the forces of a high-speed crash by nothing more than the flimsy steel of the car's body panels and the uncertain grace of fate. The injuries were frequent, and the deaths were not uncommon. Drivers were burned, broken, and killed with a regularity that would have shut down any modern sport in a matter of weeks. The funerals were attended by the same men who had competed alongside the deceased, and the races resumed the following weekend, because that was the culture, because that was the bargain, because the men who raced understood the risks and accepted them as the price of doing what they loved. The first NASCAR strictly stock race was held on June the 19th, 1949, at Charlotte Speedway, a 3/4-mile dirt track in Charlotte, North Carolina. The race drew a crowd of approximately 13,000 spectators and was won by a driver named Jim Roper, who had learned about the event from a mention in a comic strip. The winner's purse was $2,000, a sum that was significant for a working-class man in post-war America, but that was a fraction of what the sports champions would eventually earn. The race was disorganized, chaotic, and by modern standards, barely recognizable as a professional sporting event. But it was a beginning, and from that beginning, the sport would grow into a multi-billion-dollar industry that would captivate millions of fans and produce some of the most extraordinary athletes in the history of American sport. The transformation from dirt track novelty to national spectacle occurred gradually, driven by a series of developments that expanded the sport's reach and elevated its profile. The construction of Darlington Raceway in 1950, the first large paved track designed specifically for stock car racing, was a landmark moment, demonstrating that the sport could aspire to venues that matched the ambition of its founders. The opening of Daytona International Speedway in 1959, the massive, high-banked superspeedway that Bill France Sr. built on the Florida coast, was an even more transformative event, providing the sport with a venue that was equal in scale and spectacle to any racing facility in the world. The drivers who competed during these early decades were a breed apart. They came from farms and factories and garages, men who had learned to drive not in racing schools but on the roads and the dirt tracks of the rural South. They were tough, independent, and possessed of a physical courage that was tested every time they climbed behind the wheel. The fatality rate was high, and every driver who competed during the 1950s and 1960s did so with the knowledge that any race could be his last. Among the pioneers were names that would become legends. Lee Petty, the patriarch of the Petty dynasty, who won 3 championships and established his family as the first family of stock car racing. Junior Johnson, the former moonshine runner from Wilkes County, North Carolina, who became one of the sport's greatest drivers and later one of its most successful team owners. Fireball Roberts, the handsome, charismatic Florida driver, whose talent and showmanship made him one of the sport's first genuine stars, and whose death in a fiery crash at Charlotte in 1964 was one of the sport's earliest and most devastating tragedies. Curtis Turner, the fearless Virginian, whose driving exploits and personal excesses made him one of the most colourful figures in the sport's early history. These men built the foundation on which the next generation of champions would stand. They proved that stock car racing could attract large audiences, generate significant revenue, and produce athletes whose skills and courage were worthy of national attention. They established the traditions and the culture of the sport, the emphasis on toughness and self-reliance, the respect for hard work and mechanical knowledge, the acceptance of danger as an inherent and non-negotiable aspect of the enterprise. By the time Cale Yarborough arrived on the Cup Series scene in the mid-1960s, the sport had evolved significantly from its dirt track origins, but still retained much of the rawness and the danger that had characterized its early years. The cars were faster and more sophisticated, but the safety equipment remained primitive by modern standards. The tracks were larger and better maintained, but the guardrails were still inadequate, and the medical facilities were still rudimentary. The purses were larger, but the financial rewards were still far from guaranteed, and many drivers supplemented their racing income with outside jobs or relied on the support of family members and friends. The culture of the sport was still deeply rooted in its southern, working-class origins. The drivers were, for the most part, men who had grown up in rural communities, who spoke with southern accents, and who carried themselves with the unpretentious directness of people who had earned everything they had through physical labor and personal risk. The fans who filled the grandstands were drawn from the same demographic, working-class Southerners who saw in the drivers a reflection of their own values and their own struggles. This was the world that shaped Cale Yarborough, a world where toughness was the supreme virtue, where the ability to take a punch, literal or figurative, and keep going was more respected than any amount of natural talent or technical sophistication, where the men who rose to the top were not the men with the smoothest technique or the most refined strategy, but the men with the biggest hearts, the strongest wills, and the most absolute refusal to accept defeat. Yarborough was a product of this world, shaped by its values and tempered by its demands. And the 3 consecutive championships he won in the late 1970s were the ultimate expression of the culture that produced him. The economic structure of the sport during Yarborough's era was fundamentally different from the corporate-sponsored, television-driven model that characterizes modern NASCAR. Teams were funded by a combination of modest sponsorship deals, race purses, and the personal investments of the team owners. The sponsorship landscape was dominated by automotive and petroleum companies, with consumer brands only beginning to recognize the marketing potential of aligning themselves with stock car racing. The total revenue generated by the sport was a fraction of what it would eventually become, and the financial margins for most teams were thin, requiring constant attention to costs and a willingness to improvise with limited resources. The television coverage of the sport was sporadic and often delayed, with most races receiving only brief highlights on regional sports programs rather than the live, national broadcast that modern fans take for granted. The 1979 Daytona 500, the race that ended with the famous fight involving Cale Yarborough and the Allison brothers, was a watershed moment precisely because it was the first 500-mile race to be broadcast live on national network television. Before that broadcast, NASCAR was, for most Americans outside the South, an unknown or a curiosity. After it, the sport was on the path to becoming a national phenomenon. The era context is essential for understanding the magnitude of Cale Yarborough's achievement. The 3 consecutive championships of 1976 through 1978 were won in a sport that was still finding its footing as a national enterprise. In an era when the resources available to the teams were modest, the danger was extreme, and the competition was provided by some of the most talented and most determined drivers the sport has ever produced. Richard Petty was in his prime. David Pearson was still winning races with a frequency that placed him among the greatest of all time. Bobby Allison was in the midst of a career that would produce 84 victories. Darrell Waltrip was emerging as a force that would dominate the next decade. Buddy Baker, Benny Parsons, and a dozen other drivers of genuine championship caliber were competing every week. Against this field, in this era, with the resources available to a single-car team operated by a former moonshine runner from the North Carolina mountains, Cale Yarborough won 3 straight championships. The achievement is not diminished by time, it is magnified by it, because the more you understand the context in which it occurred, the more extraordinary it becomes. The partnership between Yarborough and Jimmie Johnson, the team owner who provided the cars and the strategy that carried Cale to his championships, was one of the most productive and most consequential partnerships in the history of the sport. Johnson, who had been one of the greatest drivers of the 1950s and early 1960s before transitioning to team ownership, brought to the partnership a racing knowledge that was unmatched, a willingness to push the boundaries of the rules, and a competitive instinct that mirrored Yarborough's own. The two men, both products of the rural South, both shaped by the culture of toughness and self-reliance that defined their communities, formed a partnership that was greater than the sum of its parts. Johnson's cars were fast, often controversially so. He was a master of the grey areas in the NASCAR rulebook, finding competitive advantages in the spaces between what was explicitly permitted and what was explicitly forbidden. His engines were powerful, his aerodynamic innovations were ahead of their time, and his understanding of what a stock car needed to go fast on any given track was encyclopedic. When Johnson's engineering ingenuity was combined with Yarborough's driving ferocity, the result was a package that the rest of the field could not consistently match. The moonshine roots of the sport are not just colourful backstory, they are essential context for understanding the culture that produced men like Cale Yarborough and Jimmie Johnson. The values that the moonshine runners carried with them, the self-reliance, the ingenuity, the willingness to take risks, the refusal to submit to authority or accept limitations, these values became the foundational values of the sport itself. Yarborough embodied them as completely as any driver who ever competed, and the 3 consecutive championships he won were, in a very real sense, the culmination of a tradition that began on the back roads of Appalachia, with men running whiskey in the dark, testing their courage against the night. The danger that characterized the sport during its early decades was not an abstraction. It was a constant, palpable presence that shaped every aspect of the racing experience. The drivers who competed during the 1950s and 1960s did so with the knowledge that any race could be their last, that the combination of high speeds, primitive safety equipment, and unforgiving track surfaces created conditions in which fatal outcomes were not exceptional but routine. The roll call of drivers who died during the sport's first 2 decades is long and sobering, a litany of names that represents the human cost of a pursuit that offered thrills and glory, but that demanded, in return, a willingness to accept risks that would be considered unconscionable by modern standards. The safety equipment available to drivers during the era was minimal. Helmets were open-face designs that offered limited protection. Uniforms were made of cotton rather than the fire-resistant materials that modern drivers wear. Roll cages were rudimentary, designed to prevent the most catastrophic structural failures, but offering limited protection against the kinds of lateral and intrusion impacts that are the most common causes of serious injury in stock car crashes. The fuel cells were not designed to prevent leakage in the event of a crash, and fires were a constant and terrifying danger, one that claimed the life of more than one driver during the sport's early decades. The medical response capabilities at the tracks were equally primitive. The infield care centres that are standard features of modern NASCAR venues were, in the early days, little more than first aid stations staffed by personnel whose training and equipment were not adequate for the kinds of injuries that high-speed racing could produce. The time between a crash and the arrival of competent medical care could be measured in minutes rather than seconds, a delay that in some cases made the difference between life and death. Into this world, the world of dirt tracks and danger and death, stepped the generation of drivers that included Cale Yarborough. These men knew the risks, they accepted them. They raced anyway, driven by a combination of competitive passion, economic necessity, and the intangible, unquenchable desire to go fast that has animated human beings since the invention of the wheel. The courage required to climb into a stock car in the 1960s, knowing that the car offered minimal protection, that the track offered no forgiveness, and that the medical response in the event of a serious crash was inadequate, was a courage that went beyond what most people can comprehend. It was the courage of men who loved what they did enough to risk dying for it, and who accepted the risk with a clarity that was both admirable and, to outside observers, slightly terrifying. The economic transformation of the sport, from its dirt track origins to the television-driven spectacle it would become during Yarborough's championship years, was a gradual process that unfolded over 3 decades. The construction of large, purpose-built tracks like Daytona, Charlotte, and Talladega provided the infrastructure for bigger events and larger audiences. The growth of the sponsor relationships, from small local businesses to national brands, provided the financial resources that allowed teams to invest in better equipment and more sophisticated engineering, and the increasing attention of the national media, culminating in the live CBS broadcast of the 1979 Daytona 500, provided the exposure that transformed NASCAR from a southern novelty into a national enterprise. This transformation was not without its tensions. The old guard, the men who had built the sport from nothing and who valued its grassroots, working-class identity, sometimes clashed with the new forces of commercialization and professionalization that the transformation brought. The tension between tradition and progress, between the sport's roots and its ambitions, was a recurring theme throughout the 1970s and 1980s, and it was a tension that drivers like Yarborough, who embodied the old values while competing at the new levels, navigated with varying degrees of comfort. The R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company's sponsorship of the Cup Series, which began in 1971, and which gave the series the Winston Cup name it carried for more than 3 decades, was a watershed moment in the commercial history of the sport. The Reynolds sponsorship brought a level of financial investment and marketing sophistication that the sport had never previously experienced, providing the resources for larger purses, better promotion, and more professional organization of the competitive schedule. The Winston Cup era, which coincided with the prime of Yarborough's career, was the era in which the sport made its most significant leap from regional pursuit to national spectacle, and Yarborough's championships were among the signature achievements of this transformative period. The tracks that Yarborough competed on during his career were themselves products of the sport's evolution. Daytona International Speedway, built by Bill France Sr. and opened in 1959, was the flagship venue, a 2.5-mile superspeedway whose high-banked turns and long straightaways produced speeds that had never been seen in stock car racing. Darlington Raceway, the first large paved track in the sport, was the veteran venue, a track whose asymmetric layout and abrasive surface tested every dimension of a driver's skill. Charlotte Motor Speedway provided the sport with a home in the heart of its geographic base, hosting major events that attracted the sport's most passionate fans. Bristol Motor Speedway, the half-mile concrete bowl in Tennessee, provided the most intense and most physical short-track racing on the schedule. Each of these tracks played a role in shaping Yarborough's career and in testing his ability to adapt and compete across the full range of venues that the Cup Series schedule presented. His success at all of them, from the superspeedways to the short tracks to the road courses, was a testament to the comprehensive nature of his talent and the breadth of his competitive preparation. The moonshine heritage of the sport is not merely colourful backstory. It is the cultural DNA that runs through everything NASCAR has been and everything it has become. The values that the moonshine runners carried: independence, ingenuity, the willingness to risk everything for the prize, were the values that built the sport and that continue to define its character. Cale Yarborough, the tobacco farmer's son who became a three-time champion, was the embodiment of these values, the living proof that the culture that produced the sport could also produce its greatest champions. The broader cultural landscape of the American South during the era of Cale Yarborough's career shaped the sport's identity in ways that continue to resonate. The South of the 1960s and 1970s was a region in transformation, grappling with the legacy of segregation, the upheaval of the civil rights movement, and the economic shifts that were reshaping its agricultural and industrial base. Stock car racing, which had originated in the region, and which drew its participants and its audiences primarily from the white, working-class communities of the South, was both a reflection of and a refuge from the turbulence of the era. For the fans who filled the grandstands at Daytona and Charlotte and Bristol and Darlington, stock car racing was more than entertainment. It was a cultural institution, a space where the values they held dear, hard work, self-reliance, loyalty, and the belief that a man's worth was measured by what he did rather than where he came from, were celebrated and affirmed. The drivers were not distant celebrities. They were neighbours, fellow Southerners who spoke the same language and shared the same background, and who had risen to prominence through the same combination of talent and effort that the fans aspired to in their own lives. Yarborough, the tobacco farmer's son, was a perfect embodiment of this cultural dynamic. His background was familiar to the fans, his values were their values. His success was a validation of the belief that a person from a modest, rural background could achieve extraordinary things through the application of will and effort. The connection between Yarborough and the fans was not manufactured by marketing departments or media consultants. It was organic, the natural product of a shared cultural identity and a shared understanding of what the sport meant. The rival organizations that competed during Yarborough's era reflected the diversity and the competitive intensity of the sport during its transition to national prominence. The Petty Enterprises operation, run by the Petty family and anchored by the incomparable Richard Petty, was the sport's most famous and most successful team, a family dynasty that had been winning races and championships since the 1950s. The Wood Brothers team, based in Stuart, Virginia, was one of the most respected operations in the sport, known for its engineering excellence and its innovative pit stop techniques. The DeGard team, which would later carry Bobby Allison to his championship, was an emerging force that combined professional management with competitive ambition, and a host of smaller independent operations, run by owner-drivers and family teams, provided the depth and the variety that made the Cup Series field one of the most competitive in professional sport. Against this backdrop of organizational diversity and competitive intensity, the Yarborough-Johnson partnership achieved a level of dominance that reshaped the sport's competitive landscape. The 3 consecutive championships were not just victories for one driver and one team. They were a statement about what was possible in stock car racing, a demonstration that sustained excellence could be achieved through the right combination of talent, preparation, and competitive philosophy. The statement resonated across the sport, inspiring other teams to elevate their own standards and to pursue the kind of excellence that Yarborough and Johnson had demonstrated. The tyre technology of the era was another factor that shaped the competitive landscape in which Yarborough competed. The tyres available to Cup Series teams in the 1970s were significantly less sophisticated than the modern racing tyres that are custom engineered for each track and each set of conditions. The tyres of Yarborough's era were more prone to failure, less consistent in their grip characteristics, and more sensitive to changes in temperature and track conditions. Tyre management was a critical skill, and the drivers who could extract the maximum performance from their tyres while preserving them for the critical closing laps of a race held a significant competitive advantage. Yarborough's approach to tyre management reflected the broader pattern of his competitive philosophy. He drove his tyres hard, pushing them to the edge of their performance envelope, trusting his feel for the car and his understanding of the tyre's behaviour to tell him when he was approaching the limit. The approach was risky, because pushing too hard could result in a tyre failure that would destroy the car and potentially injure the driver. But the approach was also effective, because it allowed Yarborough to extract lap times from his tyres that more conservative drivers could not match. The engine programs of the 1970s were the heart of the competitive enterprise. The cars that competed in the Cup Series were powered by large displacement V8 engines that produced between 500 and 600 horsepower, depending on the track and the specific engine package being run. The engines were built by hand, assembled by specialists who understood the tolerances and the characteristics of each component, and who could produce engines that were both powerful and reliable, the two qualities that were most essential to competitive success. Jimmie Johnson's engine program was one of the best in the sport, producing horsepower numbers that were consistently among the highest in the field. Johnson's approach to engine building was systematic and meticulous, combining traditional craftsmanship with an intuitive understanding of the mechanical principles that governed engine performance. The engines that powered Yarborough's championship cars were products of this approach, built to Johnson's exacting specifications and tested under conditions that simulated the demands of race day competition. The fuel strategy dimension of racing during Yarborough's era was less sophisticated than the computer-modelled approaches that modern teams employ. The calculations were done by hand or by simple estimation, and the decisions about when to pit and how much fuel to take were based on experience and judgment rather than on the real-time data that modern pit crews have at their disposal. The ability to make the right strategic calls under pressure was an important competitive skill, and the Johnson team's strategic acumen was one of the factors that contributed to the 3 consecutive championships. The pit stops themselves were conducted under conditions that would seem chaotic by modern standards. The pit crews of the 1970s were composed of mechanics and team members who performed pit duties in addition to their other responsibilities, rather than the dedicated, athletically trained pit crews that modern teams employ. The stops were slower, less choreographed, and more prone to error than modern pit stops, and the time lost or gained in pit lane could make the difference between winning and losing a race. Yarborough's ability to manage the transitions between the track and pit lane, to communicate effectively with his crew about the car's condition and his strategic preferences, and to maintain his competitive focus through the disruptive process of a pit stop was another dimension of the comprehensive skill set that carried him to championships. The coordination between driver and crew was essential, and the chemistry that Yarborough developed with the Jimmie Johnson team during the championship years was a critical factor in the team's sustained success. William Caleb Yarborough was born on March the 27th, 1939, in Timmonsville, South Carolina, a small farming community in the PD region of the state, about 70 miles east of Columbia. The Yarborough family farmed tobacco, the crop that had sustained the economy of the Carolina Low Country for generations, and the rhythms of Cale's childhood were the rhythms of the agricultural year, planting and cultivating and harvesting under the relentless South Carolina sun, the work hard and physical and unrelenting in the way that farm work has always been. The PD region of South Carolina in the 1940s and 1950s was a world of dirt roads and small towns, of churches and general stores and one-room schoolhouses, of families that had been working the same land for generations, and that expected their children to do the same. It was not a world that produced race car drivers, or at least it was not a world that expected to produce them. The nearest thing to a racing culture in Timmonsville was the occasional Saturday night jaunt to a local dirt track where modified cars ran in circles on a rutted oval while the spectators drank beer and hollered from the wooden bleachers. Cale was small. He would always be small. 5 feet 7 inches, 150 pounds at his competitive weight, built more like a jockey than an athlete in any conventional sport. But what he lacked in size he compensated for with a ferocity that was evident from childhood. He was tough in the way that small boys in rural southern communities learn to be tough, the kind of tough that comes from being underestimated and from proving, again and again, that size is an unreliable measure of the fight in a man. He fought, he wrestled, he played football despite being outweighed by every other player on the field, and he discovered, at an early age, that the thing he could do better than anyone else was drive. The stories of his early encounters with speed are part of the Yarborough legend, polished by decades of retelling, but rooted in a core of truth that his later career would confirm. The alligator wrestling, the rattlesnake bite, the time he snuck into a race car at the age of 17 and ran a few laps at Darlington Raceway before being discovered and pulled from the car. The details vary depending on the source, but the essential character they reveal is consistent. A young man of extraordinary physical courage and absolute determination, a boy who looked at the world and saw not limitations but challenges, and who approached every challenge with the same unshakable conviction that he could overcome it through sheer force of will. Yarborough's entry into professional racing was not smooth or immediate. He did not have the family connections to racing that some of his contemporaries enjoyed. He did not have the financial resources to buy competitive equipment. He had talent, and he had will, and he had the willingness to work harder and take more risks than anyone else in the field. He began racing on the dirt tracks of South Carolina and North Carolina in the late 1950s, learning the craft through the brutal educational process of competing against more experienced drivers on tracks that offered no forgiveness for mistakes. His early Cup Series appearances were sporadic and often disappointing. He ran his first Cup race in 1957 at age 18 at the Southern 500 at Darlington, the track that had captured his imagination as a boy. The results in the early years were modest, reflecting the limitations of the equipment available to a young driver without significant financial backing. But the talent was evident to those who watched closely, and the determination was unmistakable. Yarborough was not a driver who was content to fill the field. He was a driver who intended to win, and the gap between his ambitions and his results in the early years only intensified his resolve. The breakthrough came gradually, through a combination of improved equipment, growing experience, and the development of relationships with team owners who recognized his ability and were willing to invest in his potential. By the mid-1960s, Yarborough was competing regularly in the Cup Series and producing results that placed him among the sport's rising stars. He won his first Cup Series race in 1965 at Valdosta Speedway in Georgia, a short-track victory that was the first entry in a ledger that would eventually reach 83. The Daytona 500 victories were a particularly significant element of Yarborough's career portfolio. He won the Great American Race 4 times in 1968, 1977, 1983, and 1984. The 4 Daytona 500 victories placed him among the most successful drivers in the history of the race, a distinction that reflected his mastery of superspeedway racing and his ability to perform at his best on the sport's grandest stage. Each Daytona victory carried its own story, its own drama, its own contribution to the legend of a driver who seemed to rise to the occasion whenever the stakes were highest. The partnership with Jimmie Johnson, which began in the mid-1970s, was the catalytic event that transformed Yarborough from a very good driver into a great one. Johnson, who had retired from driving in 1966 to focus on team ownership, was one of the most brilliant and most resourceful figures in the history of the sport. His racing knowledge was encyclopedic, his understanding of car setup and engine performance was unmatched, and his willingness to push the boundaries of the rules in pursuit of competitive advantage was legendary. Johnson recognized in Yarborough a driver whose competitive mentality matched his own. Both men were products of the rural South. Both men valued toughness and determination above all other qualities. Both men approached racing not as a hobby or a profession, but as a calling, a fundamental expression of who they were. The alignment of their competitive philosophies created a partnership that was, during the late 1970s, the most formidable in the sport. The cars that Johnson prepared for Yarborough were consistently among the fastest in the field. Johnson's engine program produced horsepower numbers that were the envy of the garage, and his aerodynamic innovations, some of which operated in the grey areas of the rulebook, gave the team an advantage on the high-speed tracks that constituted a significant portion of the schedule. The combination of Johnson's cars and Yarborough's driving was a partnership of complementary strengths. The engineer and the warrior, the strategist and the executor, each man making the other better. The 1976 championship was the first of the 3 consecutive titles, and the beginning of a run that would establish Yarborough as one of the greatest drivers in the history of the sport. He won 9 races that season, a dominant total that demonstrated the superiority of the Yarborough-Johnson combination. He accumulated points with a consistency that reflected not just the speed of the car, but the discipline of the driver, the ability to manage a 30-race championship season with the strategic intelligence that the format demanded. The 9 victories in 1976 included wins at a diverse array of tracks, from the superspeedways of Daytona and Talladega to the short tracks of Bristol and Martinsville to the road course at Riverside. The diversity of the winning venues demonstrated that Yarborough's championship was not a function of domination at any single type of track, but was built on a comprehensive competence that extended across the full range of the schedule. He could win anywhere, on any surface, in any conditions, and the breadth of his ability was one of the most impressive aspects of his championship run. The championship field that Yarborough defeated in 1976 included several drivers who were themselves among the greatest in the history of the sport. Richard Petty, the defending champion and the most prolific winner in the sport's history, was a formidable rival whose 7 championships and 200 victories established a standard of excellence that seemed unassailable. David Pearson, the Silver Fox, was widely regarded as the most naturally talented driver of his generation, a man whose skill behind the wheel was so refined that it appeared almost effortless. Bobby Allison, Benny Parsons, Buddy Baker, and Darrell Waltrip were all drivers of genuine championship caliber who were capable of winning races and challenging for titles in any given season. Against this field, Yarborough's 9-win season was a declaration of supremacy. He was not just the best driver in the sport that year, he was the best by a margin that left no room for debate. The 1977 season was even more dominant. Yarborough won 9 races again, matching his victory total from the previous year and once again outpacing the field by a margin that reflected the combined superiority of his talent and Johnson's preparation. The second consecutive championship was significant not just as a competitive achievement, but as a statement of sustained excellence, proof that the 1976 title was not an anomaly, but the product of a partnership that was operating at a level the rest of the field could not match. And it gets harder to appreciate the full magnitude of the achievement without understanding the physical demands of a NASCAR season in the 1970s. 30 races, spread across a schedule that ran from February to November, at tracks across the country, in cars that had no power steering, no air conditioning, and cockpit temperatures that regularly exceeded 130 degrees Fahrenheit. The drivers wore cotton uniforms that provided minimal protection from the heat and the fire. The seats were rudimentary. The safety harnesses were basic. Every race was an endurance test that pushed the human body to its limits, and maintaining championship-caliber performance across a full season required a level of physical fitness and mental resilience that went far beyond what most people can imagine. Yarborough's physical conditioning was a significant competitive advantage. Despite his small stature, he was extraordinarily strong, built like a compact block of muscle that could absorb the punishment of a stock car race without the fatigue that diminished the performance of larger, less conditioned drivers. He trained with an intensity that was unusual for the era, maintaining a fitness regimen that would have been more at home in a professional football team's training facility than in a stock car garage. The physical preparation was a reflection of his competitive philosophy, the conviction that every possible advantage, however small, was worth pursuing, and that the margin between winning and losing was often determined not by the car or the strategy, but by the driver's ability to maintain his focus and his physical performance throughout the race. The 1978 season completed the three-peat, a term that had not yet been invented but that perfectly described what Yarborough accomplished. He won 10 races, his highest single-season total, and ran away with the championship by a margin that underscored the dominance of the Yarborough-Johnson partnership. The 10 victories included wins at Daytona, Bristol, Charlotte, and Darlington, demonstrating once again the breadth of Yarborough's ability across the full spectrum of tracks on the schedule. 3 consecutive championships, 28 victories across 3 seasons, a winning percentage during the championship years that placed Yarborough in a statistical category occupied by only a handful of drivers in the history of the sport. The achievement was unprecedented when it occurred, and it remained unmatched for nearly 3 decades until Jimmie Johnson won 5 consecutive championships between 2006 and 2010. Even then, the Johnson run, as extraordinary as it was, unfolded in an era of restrictor plates and fabricated bodies and engineering resources that would have been unimaginable in the late 1970s. Yarborough's three-peat was achieved with the tools and the technology of a different era, in cars that were less safe, on tracks that were less forgiving, against a field that included some of the most talented drivers the sport has ever seen. The driving style that carried Yarborough to his championships was a reflection of the man himself, aggressive, relentless, and absolutely unafraid. Yarborough drove a stock car the way a boxer fights, always pressing forward, always looking for the opening, always willing to take a risk to gain a position. He was not a patient driver in the way that some champions are patient, content to run near the front and wait for the race to come to them. He was an attacker, a man who believed that the best way to win a race was to take the lead as early as possible and hold it through a combination of speed, aggression, and sheer force of will. This approach carried risks. Aggressive drivers crash more often than cautious ones, and Yarborough's career included its share of wrecks, some of them spectacular and some of them frightening. He was involved in crashes that destroyed cars, and that could have destroyed the driver inside them, and his willingness to climb from the wreckage and return to racing the following week was a testament to the physical toughness and the mental resilience that defined his competitive character. But here is what makes this story unforgettable. The aggression was not reckless. It was calculated. Yarborough knew the limits of his car, the limits of the track, and the limits of his own body, with a precision that allowed him to operate closer to those limits than anyone else in the field. The aggression that his competitors perceived as wild was, in reality, the product of an extraordinarily refined understanding of where the limits were, combined with the courage to push right up to those limits and hold the car there, lap after lap, for the duration of a race. The rivals who competed against Yarborough during the championship years have spoken about the experience with a mixture of respect and frustration that reveals the impact he had on the field. Richard Petty, who knew more about winning championships than any other driver alive, acknowledged that Yarborough during the three-peat years was operating at a level that was difficult to match. David Pearson, whose own talent was extraordinary, recognized in Yarborough a competitive intensity that supplemented his driving skill with a psychological dimension that gave him an edge in the critical moments of a race. Bobby Allison, whose own career produced 84 victories and a championship, competed against Yarborough with the fierce determination that characterized all of his racing. But he, too, acknowledged the difficulty of defeating a man who simply refused to lose. The truth gets heavier when you consider what Yarborough sacrificed for his championships. The racing life of the 1970s was all-consuming, demanding time, energy, and focus that left limited room for the other aspects of a man's existence. Betty Yarborough, Cale's wife, was the steady presence at home who maintained the family while her husband was on the road, competing at tracks across the country for 9 months of the year. The marriage endured, a testament to the strength of the bond between them and to Betty Jo's willingness to accept the demands that professional racing placed on their relationship. The children grew up with a father who was often absent, a man whose profession took him away from home for extended periods, and whose mental and physical energy, when he was home, was often consumed by the preparation for the next race. Yarborough was a devoted father by the standards of his era and his profession, but the standards were set by a culture that prioritized competition above almost everything else, and the compromises that this prioritization demanded were real and significant. The transition from the championship years to the later stages of Yarborough's career was gradual rather than sudden. After the 3 consecutive championships, the dominance receded, though the competitiveness remained. Yarborough continued to win races and to contend for championships throughout the late 1970s and into the 1980s, producing seasons that would have been the career highlights of most drivers, but that were measured, inevitably, against the extraordinary standard of the three-peat years. The separation from Junior Johnson's team, which occurred in the early 1980s, was a significant moment in Yarborough's career. The partnership that had produced the 3 consecutive championships was one of the most successful in the history of the sport, and its dissolution left both men searching for the chemistry that they had found together. Johnson would go on to win championships with other drivers, including Darrell Waltrip and later Bill Elliott, demonstrating that his success was not dependent on any single driver, and Yarborough would continue to compete at a high level, winning races for other teams and maintaining his position among the sport's elite. But the magic of the Yarborough-Johnson partnership, the specific alchemy that had produced 3 consecutive championships, was not replicated by either man with another partner. The early setbacks that Yarborough experienced in his Cup Series career were formative in ways that his later success obscured. In the years before the Junior Johnson partnership, Yarborough competed for a series of teams with varying levels of competence and resources, producing results that were inconsistent and often frustrating. He showed flashes of the talent that would later carry him to championships, winning races at unexpected moments and demonstrating a speed that surprised the more established drivers in the field. But the sustained, season-long consistency that championship campaigns require eluded him, partly because of the limitations of the equipment available to him, and partly because of the developmental process that every driver must undergo before reaching their competitive peak. The experience of racing with inferior equipment taught Yarborough lessons that would prove invaluable during the championship years. He learned to extract the maximum performance from a car that was not the fastest in the field, a skill that is essential in a sport where mechanical reliability and tyre management are as important as outright speed. He learned the strategic dimension of racing, the importance of pit stop timing and fuel strategy, and the ability to manage a long race with an eye toward the finish rather than the individual lap. And he learned the psychological dimension of competition, the ability to maintain confidence and competitive intensity through periods of disappointment and frustration. These lessons were deposited in a mental bank that Yarborough would draw upon throughout his career. When the Junior Johnson partnership provided him with cars that were among the fastest in the field, the skills he had developed during the lean years, the strategic intelligence, the ability to manage a race, the mental toughness, combined with the superior equipment to produce a package that the rest of the field could not consistently match. The Junior Johnson operation was, by the standards of the era, a model of efficiency and competitive excellence. Johnson ran a single-car team from his base in Ingle Hollow, North Carolina, an operation that was small by modern standards, but that was among the most effective in the sport. The team's advantage was rooted in Johnson's extraordinary knowledge of race car engineering and in his willingness to push the boundaries of the rules in search of competitive advantage. Johnson's most famous innovation was his discovery of the aerodynamic principle that became known as drafting, the technique of using the slipstream of a leading car to reduce wind resistance and increase speed. Johnson had pioneered the use of drafting at Daytona in the early 1960s, recognizing that a car following closely behind another car could travel at the same speed while using less horsepower, a discovery that revolutionized superspeedway racing. And that remains one of the fundamental strategic elements of the sport. The application of this and other engineering insights to the cars that Yarborough drove during the championship years gave the team a consistent competitive advantage. The engines were powerful and reliable, produced by an engine program that Johnson supervised with meticulous attention to detail. The chassis setup was optimized for each track, reflecting Johnson's deep understanding of the specific demands that each venue placed on the car's handling characteristics. And the aerodynamic preparation was among the best in the sport, taking advantage of Johnson's intuitive understanding of airflow and resistance to produce cars that were both fast and stable at high speeds. The crew chief role during the Yarborough-Johnson era was substantially different from the crew chief role in modern NASCAR. Johnson himself served as the de facto crew chief for much of the partnership, making the setup decisions and the strategic calls that determined the team's approach to each race. The direct involvement of the team owner in the technical and strategic dimensions of the competition created a level of alignment between the car's preparation and the team's competitive strategy that was difficult for other organizations to match. The 9-win championship season of 1976 was built on a foundation of consistency that extended beyond the victories. In addition to the 9 races he won, Yarborough finished in the top 5 in 22 of the 30 races on the schedule, a level of sustained excellence that reflected the quality of the team's preparation and the driver's ability to produce strong results even on days when the car was not the fastest in the field. The consistency was the product of discipline, of the willingness to accept a strong finish when a victory was not available, of the strategic intelligence that allowed Yarborough and Johnson to manage the championship as a season-long campaign rather than a series of individual events. The second championship, in 1977, was won with similar consistency. 9 victories again, complemented by a string of top 5 and top 10 finishes that kept the points accumulating at a rate that the competition could not match. The second championship carried additional weight because it confirmed that the 1976 title was not a one-year anomaly, but the product of a partnership that was operating at a sustained level of excellence. The third championship in 1978 was the capstone, the achievement that transformed the Yarborough-Johnson partnership from merely successful to historically significant. 10 victories, the highest single-season total of the 3 championship years, produced a final standings margin that left no doubt about the superiority of the team. The 10-win season was a statement of dominance that echoed across the sport, a declaration that the Yarborough-Johnson combination was, for the purposes of the late 1970s, the standard against which all other teams would be measured. The cumulative effect of the 3 consecutive championships on the sport was significant. The three-peat established a benchmark for sustained excellence that would stand for nearly 3 decades until Jimmie Johnson surpassed it with his 5 consecutive championships, beginning in 2006. The achievement also elevated the profile of the sport, demonstrating that stock car racing could produce champions whose accomplishments were comparable in magnitude to the greatest achievements in any sport. The three-peat was not just a racing achievement, it was a sporting achievement. one that demanded recognition from the broader world of athletics. The relationship between driver and team owner during the championship years was characterized by a mutual respect and a shared competitive philosophy that made the partnership more than the sum of its parts. Johnson and Yarborough were both men of action rather than words, both products of the rural South, both shaped by the values of hard work and self-reliance that their communities had instilled in them. They communicated efficiently, trusting each other's judgment and each other's commitment to the shared goal of winning championships. The partnership was not always smooth, as no partnership between two strong-willed men can be, but the disagreements were resolved quickly and decisively because both men understood that the window for championship-level competition was finite, and that time spent on internal conflict was time wasted. The eventual dissolution of the partnership, which occurred in the early 1980s, was driven by a combination of factors including changing competitive dynamics, evolving sponsor relationships, and the natural life cycle of professional partnerships. Johnson went on to win championships with other drivers, including Darrell Waltrip, who won the 1981, 1982, and 1985 championships in Johnson's cars. Yarborough continued to compete for other teams, producing victories and strong performances, but never recapturing the sustained dominance of the three-peat years. The separation of Yarborough and Johnson provides a useful lens through which to evaluate the respective contributions of each man to the championship run. Johnson's subsequent success with other drivers confirms that his engineering genius and his competitive management were significant factors in the championships. But Yarborough's continued competitiveness with other teams confirms that his driving talent and his competitive intensity were genuine and transferable, not dependent on any particular car or any particular team owner. The truth is that both men were essential to the three-peat, that the championships were the product of a partnership in which each man amplified the other's strengths, and that neither man, alone, could have achieved what they achieved together. The personal dimension of the Yarborough story during the championship years includes the physical toll that the 3 consecutive campaigns exacted on his body. 90 races across 3 seasons, each one lasting 3 to 4 hours, each one conducted in extreme heat and under extreme physical stress, accumulating into a total that would challenge even the fittest athlete. Yarborough's body was subjected to forces and conditions that modern sports medicine would consider harmful, and the cumulative effects of the heat exposure, the vibration, the G-forces, and the repeated impacts of the crashes that are an inevitable part of stock car racing left their mark. The physical recovery between races was minimal by modern standards. There were no dedicated athletic trainers or physical therapists traveling with the teams. There were no ice baths, no massage therapists, no nutritional protocols designed to optimize recovery. The drivers managed their own physical condition as best they could, relying on the resilience of their bodies and the toughness of their minds to carry them from one race to the next. Yarborough's physical conditioning, which was more deliberate and more systematic than most of his contemporaries, gave him an advantage in this regard, but even the best-conditioned driver could not fully mitigate the cumulative effects of 3 consecutive championship campaigns. The psychological dimension was equally demanding. The pressure of defending a championship, of being the hunted rather than the hunter, of managing the expectations that success creates, was a constant presence during the three-peat years. Every race was an opportunity for the competition to close the gap, and every result was scrutinized by the media, the fans, and the other teams for signs that the Yarborough-Johnson dominance was waning. The psychological burden of maintaining championship-caliber performance under this scrutiny was significant, and Yarborough's ability to manage it was a testament to the mental toughness that was one of his defining characteristics. The media coverage of the sport during the championship years, while growing, was still limited compared to what modern drivers experience. The national networks broadcast only a handful of races each year, and the day-to-day coverage was provided primarily by regional newspapers and trade publications that served the sport's core audience. This limited media exposure meant that Yarborough's championships, while well known within the racing community, were less visible to the general public than the championships of later drivers who competed in an era of wall-to-wall television coverage and social media. The relative lack of national media attention during the championship years is one of the reasons that Yarborough's achievement is sometimes underappreciated by modern fans. The drivers who competed in the television age, from Dale Earnhardt and Jeff Gordon through Jimmie Johnson and beyond, benefited from a level of media exposure that made their achievements visible to a national audience in real time. Yarborough's championships, by contrast, were achieved in an era when the sport's national profile was still developing, and the result is that his accomplishments are sometimes overshadowed by those of drivers who competed under the brighter spotlight of later decades. This underappreciation is a historical injustice that the passage of time should correct. The 3 consecutive championships, viewed in their proper context, are among the greatest achievements in the history of American motorsport, regardless of the era in which they were accomplished. The competition was fierce, the conditions were demanding, the risks were extreme, and the driver who prevailed, the small man from Timmonsville who refused to accept any limitation, demonstrated a level of sustained excellence that places him in the very highest tier of the sport's all-time greats. The spiritual dimension of the Yarborough-Johnson partnership deserves a final note. Both men were deeply competitive, but their competitiveness was rooted in different soils. Johnson's competitiveness was the product of a life spent in opposition to authority, the moonshine runner's instinct to outfox the law and the racing establishment. Yarborough's competitiveness was the product of a life spent in opposition to limitation, the small man's determination to prove that size and circumstance do not determine destiny. When these 2 forms of competitive intensity were aligned in pursuit of a common goal, the result was a force that the rest of the field could not withstand. The competitive landscape that Yarborough navigated during the pre-championship years was shaped by the dominance of 2 men who would become his greatest rivals. Richard Petty, the King, had established himself as the most successful driver in the history of the sport by the early 1970s, winning races and championships with a consistency that seemed almost superhuman. David Pearson, the Silver Fox, was widely regarded as the most naturally talented driver of his generation, a man whose smooth, almost effortless driving style produced victories with a regularity that challenged even Petty's dominance. These 2 men set the standard against which Yarborough would be measured when he joined the Junior Johnson team and began his championship run. The standard was extraordinarily high. Petty had won more than 150 races by the time Yarborough won his first championship. Pearson had won more than 70. The combined total of their victories dwarfed Yarborough's own record at the time, and the challenge of competing against both of them simultaneously, while also from fending off the threat posed by Bobby Allison, Buddy Baker, Benny Parsons, and the other talented drivers in the field, was immense. The fact that Yarborough met this challenge, and met it with 3 consecutive championships, is the ultimate measure of his competitive greatness. He did not merely beat the best drivers of his era, he beat all of them simultaneously for 3 straight years. The achievement required a level of sustained excellence that goes beyond what talent or luck or superior equipment can explain. It required the full engagement of a competitive will that was, in the estimation of those who witnessed it, the strongest in the sport. The philosophical contrast between Yarborough's approach and Pearson's approach to racing illuminates something important about the nature of competitive excellence. Pearson's genius was in his economy. He did the minimum necessary to win, conserving himself and his car through the early stages of a race, and then unleashing his full capabilities in the closing laps. His approach was elegant, efficient, and extraordinarily effective, producing 105 career victories with a grace that seemed almost effortless. Yarborough's genius was in his intensity. He did not conserve, he attacked. He pushed the car to its limits from the drop of the green flag and maintained the pressure throughout the race, wearing down the competition through the sheer, relentless application of speed and aggression. His approach was less elegant than Pearson's, but it was no less effective, and it produced a different kind of victory, a victory that was earned through combat rather than finesse, through the application of overwhelming force rather than surgical precision. Both approaches worked. Both produced championships and victories and legacies that place their practitioners among the greatest in the sport's history. But the contrast between them reveals that there is no single formula for competitive excellence, that greatness can be achieved through different means, and that the diversity of approaches is one of the things that makes sport and life endlessly fascinating. The transition from independent racer to championship contender was not merely a professional development. It was a personal transformation. The Yarborough who arrived at Junior Johnson's shop in the mid-1970s was a different man from the Yarborough who had been scraping together rides and running inferior equipment in the early years of his career. He was older, more experienced, and more attuned to the strategic dimensions of championship racing. He had endured the disappointments and the frustrations that come with competing at the highest level without the resources to sustain championship-caliber performance, and those disappointments had tempered him, refining his competitive instincts and teaching him the patience that sustained excellence requires. The Johnson team's operation was centered around a commitment to preparation that mirrored Yarborough's own commitment to physical conditioning. Nothing was left to chance. The cars were built with meticulous attention to detail, each component inspected and tested to ensure that it met the team standards. The engines were dyno-tested and tuned to extract the maximum power while maintaining the reliability that a 30-race championship season demanded. The setup sheets, the documents that recorded the suspension settings and the aerodynamic adjustments for each track, were the product of years of accumulated knowledge, refined through hundreds of test sessions and thousands of competitive laps. When Yarborough arrived at the shop to prepare for a race weekend, the car was already close to competitive. His role was to provide the final input, the feedback about how the car felt on the track, the observations about handling characteristics that only the driver could perceive, the adjustments that would take the car from fast to championship caliber. The process was collaborative, a dialogue between driver and engineer that reflected the mutual respect and the shared commitment to excellence that defined the partnership. The first championship in 1976 was the validation that both men had been seeking. For Johnson, it was proof that his engineering genius, applied to the right driver, could produce championships. For Yarborough, it was the culmination of a career that had been building toward this moment for nearly 2 decades, the proof that the talent and the determination he had carried with him from Timminsville were sufficient to win the sport's highest prize. The celebration was genuine but restrained, consistent with the characters of both men, who were more interested in winning the next race than in savouring the last one. The defining moment of Cale Yarborough's career in the public consciousness was not a championship or a victory. It was a fight. And the irony of that, the fact that the most famous image associated with one of the greatest champions in the history of the sport is an image of him throwing punches in the Daytona infield, tells you something important about the relationship between athletic achievement and public memory. Championships are abstract. Numbers on a page, they require context and explanation to be appreciated. A fight is immediate, visceral, and unforgettable. And the fight at the 1979 Daytona 500 was all three. The race itself was historic before the fight occurred. It was the first 500-mile stock car race to be broadcast live in its entirety on national network television, carried by CBS to an audience that was significantly larger than any that had previously watched a NASCAR event. A major snowstorm had blanketed the eastern United States, trapping millions of people in their homes on a Sunday afternoon, and many of them, searching for distraction, turned on their televisions and found themselves watching stock car racing. The race was competitive and exciting, with the lead changing hands multiple times among the sport's biggest names. But the drama that defined the event occurred on the final lap. Donnie Allison was leading the race, with Yarborough drafting behind him. As the two cars entered the backstretch, Yarborough pulled alongside Donnie and attempted to pass on the inside. Donnie moved to block. Yarborough tried again, moving even further to the inside, onto the apron of the track. The two cars made contact. The contact sent both machines careening off the backstretch and into the infield, where they came to rest in the grass. Their races finished, their positions lost. Richard Petty, who had been running in third place, inherited the lead and won the race, his sixth Daytona 500 victory. But the cameras were not following Petty across the finish line. They were focused on the backstretch, where Yarborough and Donnie Allison were climbing from their wrecked cars and beginning an argument that would quickly escalate. Bobby Allison, who had been running behind the leaders and who slowed to check on his brother, stopped his car nearby and was drawn into the confrontation. What followed was broadcast live into living rooms across America. Yarborough and Donnie Allison exchanged heated words. Yarborough swung his helmet at Bobby Allison. Bobby retaliated. The three men grappled and shoved and threw punches beside their wrecked cars, while the CBS cameras captured every moment of the melee. The images were electric, the kind of spontaneous, unscripted drama that television producers dream about, and that the viewing public devours with an appetite that more carefully choreographed entertainment cannot satisfy. The fight at the 1979 Daytona 500 was, for Cale Yarborough, both a blessing and a curse. The blessing was that it introduced his name to millions of Americans who had never watched a stock car race before, creating a level of name recognition that would have been impossible to achieve through racing results alone. The curse was that it overshadowed the racing achievements that made the name worth recognizing in the first place. Yarborough was not a brawler. He was a three-time consecutive champion, a four-time Daytona 500 winner, an 83-race winner whose career placed him among the greatest in the history of the sport. The fight was a moment, the career was a monument, but in the public memory, the moment often eclipses the monument. Yarborough's version of the events on the backstretch differed from the Allison's version, as is invariably the case in disputes that escalate to physical confrontation. Cale maintained that Donnie had blocked him unfairly, forcing him onto the apron and causing the crash. The Allisons maintained that Yarborough had made an overly aggressive move that caused the contact. The truth, as is usually the case, probably lies somewhere between the two accounts, in the grey area where competitive aggression and racing etiquette overlap, and where the rules of engagement are as much a matter of interpretation as of fact. The second defining moment of Yarborough's career was the 1968 Daytona 500, his first victory in the Great American Race. The win was significant, not just as a competitive achievement, but as a validation of Yarborough's arrival among the sport's elite. The Daytona 500 was the most prestigious event on the calendar, the race that every driver wanted to win more than any other, and Yarborough's victory announced to the sport that the kid from Timmonsville was no longer a prospect. He was a contender. The race was a demonstration of the qualities that would define Yarborough's career. He was aggressive, pushing his car to the front of the field and holding the lead through the critical closing laps. He was physically tough, maintaining his concentration and his performance through the grueling 4-hour race in the Florida heat. And he was fearless, willing to take the risks that superspeedway racing demands, running inches from the cars around him at speeds approaching 200 miles per hour, trusting his reflexes and his instincts to keep him out of the wall and ahead of the field. The third defining moment was the 1977 Daytona 500, the race that confirmed Yarborough's status as the dominant driver in the sport. Coming off his first championship in 1976, Yarborough entered Daytona as the man to beat, and he delivered on that expectation with a performance that was both dominant and thrilling. The victory was the second of his 4 Daytona 500 wins and provided the emotional and competitive launch pad for the 1977 championship season. The numbers are striking when you examine the breadth and the consistency of Yarborough's performance during the championship years. In the 3 championship seasons combined, he won 28 races, finished in the top 560 times, and led more laps than any other driver in the sport. The statistics describe a level of dominance that is almost impossible to sustain across a single season, let alone 3 consecutive seasons. Every week, for 3 years, Yarborough was either winning the race or finishing close to the front, accumulating points with a relentless consistency that wore down the opposition through sheer sustained excellence. The physical experience of racing a stock car in the 1970s was an ordeal that modern fans, accustomed to the relative comfort and safety of modern race cars, would find almost unbelievable. The cars were heavy, often weighing more than 3,500 pounds, and they were equipped with manual steering that required enormous upper body strength to manage, particularly on the tight, physical short tracks like Bristol and Martinsville. The heat in the cockpit was staggering, with temperatures regularly exceeding 130 degrees during summer races, and the drivers had no cooling systems, no climate control, nothing to protect them from the furnace-like conditions except their own physical endurance. The races lasted hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, sometimes longer when caution periods extended the time on track beyond what the schedule had anticipated. During those hours, the driver was constantly working, steering, shifting, braking, accelerating, managing tyre wear, monitoring engine temperature, communicating with the crew chief, adjusting his line to compensate for changing track conditions, maintaining his awareness of the cars around him, calculating and recalculating his strategy with every lap. The physical and mental demands were relentless, and the fatigue that accumulated over the course of a race could diminish a driver's performance in ways that were not always visible to the spectators, but that were absolutely critical in determining the outcome. Yarborough's physical conditioning allowed him to maintain his performance level through the final laps of a race when other drivers were fading. His small frame, which might have been a disadvantage in other sports, was an asset in the cockpit, where the reduced body mass meant less heat generation and less physical stress. His strength, cultivated through years of farm work and deliberate training, gave him the endurance to fight the heavy, unassisted steering through hundreds of laps without the arm and shoulder fatigue that plagued larger drivers. His mental toughness, the product of a childhood spent working tobacco fields in the South Carolina heat, allowed him to maintain his focus and his competitive intensity through conditions that would have broken less determined men. The crashes that punctuated Yarborough's career were a testament to both the dangers of the sport and the driver's extraordinary resilience. At Daytona in 1965, Yarborough was involved in a crash that sent his car tumbling through the air, end over end, in a sequence of barrel rolls that seemed certain to be fatal. The car disintegrated around him, shedding body panels and mechanical components with each revolution, until what remained was barely recognizable as an automobile. Yarborough climbed from the wreckage with minor injuries, a demonstration of either extraordinary luck or extraordinary constitution, or perhaps both. The crash would have ended many drivers' careers, not because of the physical injuries, but because of the psychological impact. The deep, primal fear that a near-fatal accident can plant in a driver's mind. Yarborough returned to racing without hesitation, a response that was consistent with his character, and that confirmed the impression, already widely held in the garage, that the man from Timminsville was not susceptible to fear in any form that the rest of the world would recognize. The rivalry between Yarborough and David Pearson, the Silver Fox, was one of the most compelling competitive narratives of the era. Pearson was, in many respects, Yarborough's opposite. Where Cale was aggressive and confrontational, Pearson was smooth and calculating. Where Cale attacked the track with brute force, Pearson caressed it with finesse. Where Cale's driving was characterized by its intensity and its physicality, Pearson's was characterized by its economy and its precision. The two men were different expressions of the same extraordinary talent, and the races they fought against each other were among the finest in the sport's history. The Petty-Pearson-Yarborough triangle was the defining competitive narrative of the 1970s. Richard Petty, the King, was the sport's most famous and most successful driver, a man whose 200 victories and 7 championships established a standard that seemed unreachable. Pearson was the most naturally gifted, the driver whose technical skill behind the wheel was acknowledged by his peers as the finest of the era, and Yarborough was the most ferocious, the man whose will to win was so overwhelming that it compensated for whatever marginal advantages his rivals might have possessed in terms of natural talent or technical refinement. The three men competed against each other with an intensity and a frequency that produced some of the most memorable racing the sport has ever witnessed. At Daytona, at Darlington, at Charlotte, at Bristol, at tracks across the country, Petty and Pearson and Yarborough battled for victories and championships with a competitiveness that elevated the sport and defined an era. The fans picked sides, aligning themselves with one of the three rivals based on personality, geography, or the indefinable chemistry that connects a fan to a particular driver, and the rivalries between the three camps added a tribal dimension to the competition that amplified the excitement. Yarborough's attempt to compete in the Indianapolis 500, the crown jewel of open-wheel racing, was one of the more surprising and revealing episodes of his career. In 1966, he entered a car in the Indy 500, seeking to test himself against the best open-wheel racers in the world, and to prove that his talent was not limited to stock cars. The attempt was bold, but ultimately unsuccessful. Yarborough qualified for the race, but was involved in an incident that ended his day early, and he did not return to Indianapolis in subsequent years. The IndyCar venture was significant not for its competitive results, but for what it revealed about Yarborough's character, his willingness to step outside his comfort zone, to challenge himself in an unfamiliar environment, and to risk failure in pursuit of a broader definition of excellence. The transition from the championship years to the later stages of Yarborough's career was marked by a gradual decline in the frequency of victories and the consistency of championship-caliber results. After the three-peat, Yarborough continued to win races and to compete at a high level, but the dominance of the 1976 through 1978 period was not sustained. The competition caught up, as competition always does when a dominant team or driver shows the rest of the field what is possible. The other teams studied the Yarborough-Johnson formula, adopted its innovations, and closed the gap that had allowed the partnership to dominate for 3 consecutive seasons. Yarborough's decision to reduce his Cup Series schedule in the 1980s, running a limited number of races rather than the full schedule, was a transition that reflected both his changing priorities and the evolving economics of the sport. The decision was controversial in some quarters, with critics suggesting that a partial schedule diminished the significance of any victories achieved. But for Yarborough, the decision was consistent with his approach to life, a recognition that there were things worth doing beyond the confines of the racetrack, and that a man's identity need not be wholly defined by his profession. The races he chose to run in the later years were often the biggest races on the calendar. The Daytona 500, the Coca-Cola 600, the Southern 500, the events that attracted the largest audiences and generated the most competitive intensity. His performances in these races demonstrated that the talent and the competitive fire were still present, even if the sustained commitment to a full championship campaign was not. Yarborough could still run with the best in the sport on any given day, and the victories he produced in the later years were a reminder that the 3-time consecutive champion had not been diminished by the passage of time, only redirected. The 1983 and 1984 Daytona 500 victories, his third and fourth, were particularly significant because they demonstrated Yarborough's enduring mastery of superspeedway racing. The Daytona 500 is the most demanding race on the calendar, not just in terms of the speed and the danger, but in terms of the strategic complexity, the constantly shifting draft dynamics, and the intense pressure that the event's prestige generates. To win the race 4 times, across a span of 16 years, was an achievement that confirmed Yarborough's place among the greatest superspeedway racers in the history of the sport. The relationship between Yarborough and the Darlington track, the track that had captured his imagination as a boy growing up just 70 miles away, was a through line of his career that connected his humble origins to his greatest achievements. Darlington was the track where he had first seen professional stock car racing, where he had snuck into a car as a teenager, where he had dreamed of competing as a professional. To win at Darlington, as he did multiple times during his career, was a fulfillment of those childhood dreams, a demonstration that the boy from Timminsville had made good on the promises he had made to himself. The full-time retirement from Cup Series competition came gradually, with Yarborough reducing his schedule through the 1980s and eventually stepping away from the sport that had defined his adult life. The final full-time season was 1988, after which Yarborough limited his racing to occasional appearances that grew increasingly infrequent. The retirement was not accompanied by the kind of farewell tour that modern drivers receive, with tributes and celebrations at every track. It was quieter, more in keeping with the character of a man who had always let his driving do the talking and who had never sought the spotlight for its own sake. The post-retirement life that Yarborough built in South Carolina reflected the same values that had defined his racing career: hard work, self-reliance, and a deep connection to the land and the community that had shaped him. He turned his attention to business interests, including farming, automotive dealerships, and other ventures that kept him engaged and productive in the years after his racing career ended. He remained connected to the sport through occasional appearances at events and through the relationships he maintained with the drivers, team owners, and officials who had been part of his racing world. The NASCAR Hall of Fame induction in 2012 was the formal recognition of a career that had long since secured its place among the greatest in the sport's history. The ceremony was an opportunity for the sport to honor a man whose 3 consecutive championships, 83 victories, and 4 Daytona 500 wins constituted one of the most impressive bodies of work in the history of American motorsport. Yarborough accepted the honor with the quiet pride of a man who knew what he had accomplished and who did not need external validation to confirm it. The key moments and challenges of Cale Yarborough's career, taken together, paint a portrait of a competitor whose defining characteristic was his refusal to accept any limitation that the world tried to impose on him. He was too small to be a football player. He played anyway. He was too poor to be a race car driver. He drove anyway. He was too aggressive to sustain championship consistency. He won 3 in a row. He was too old to compete with the younger generation. He won Daytona 500s in his 40s. At every point in his career, the world told Cale Yarborough what he could not do, and at every point, he responded by doing it anyway. The stubbornness was his genius, the refusal was his gift, and the 3 consecutive championships were the ultimate expression of a will that simply could not be broken. The Bristol Motor Speedway battles were another defining element of Yarborough's competitive portfolio. Bristol, the half-mile concrete bowl nestled in the mountains of northeast Tennessee, was the most physically demanding track on the schedule. The steep banking, the narrow racing surface, and the close proximity of the concrete walls created an environment that was equal parts thrilling and terrifying. Races at Bristol were wars of attrition, grinding contests that tested a driver's endurance, his patience, and his willingness to use the bumper when necessary. Yarborough thrived at Bristol. The tight quarters and the physical nature of the racing suited his aggressive style, and his victories at the Tennessee track were among the most hard-fought and most satisfying of his career. The ability to win at Bristol, a track that rewarded toughness and determination as much as raw speed, was consistent with the broader narrative of Yarborough's career, the story of a man whose competitive character was his greatest asset. The Darlington races held particular significance because of Yarborough's personal connection to the track. Darlington Raceway, located just 70 miles from his home in Timminsville, was the track that had first inspired his love of racing, the track where he had sneaked into a car as a teenager, the track that represented the dream of professional competition that had animated his youth. To compete at Darlington as a professional and to win there was a fulfillment of those early dreams, a closing of the circle that connected the boy from the tobacco farm to the champion on the victory stand. The Darlington races were also among the most demanding on the schedule. The track's asymmetric layout, with one end tighter than the other, created a driving challenge that was unique in the sport. The abrasive surface chewed through tyres with a ferocity that could transform a competitive car into a struggling one within a few laps. The walls were close, and the Darlington stripe, the mark that a car acquired when it scraped against the outside wall, was a badge that most drivers wore at some point during their Darlington careers. Yarborough's success at the track demonstrated his ability to maintain precision and concentration under conditions that tested even the most skilled and experienced drivers. The Charlotte Motor Speedway races were the showcase events of Yarborough's career, the races that attracted the largest audiences and generated the most media attention. Charlotte, located in the heart of NASCAR country, hosted two of the sport's most prestigious races, the World 600 in May and the National 500 in October. The races were high-profile events that drew the best drivers and the largest crowds, and Yarborough's performances at Charlotte were consistently among the strongest of his career. The Talladega Superspeedway races provided some of the most dramatic moments of Yarborough's career. Talladega, the fastest track on the schedule, was a venue where the combination of extreme speeds and close-pack racing produced finishes that were decided by the thinnest of margins. The drafting dynamics at Talladega were complex and constantly shifting, requiring the driver to make split-second decisions about positioning, timing, and the management of the aerodynamic forces that governed pack racing. Yarborough's superspeedway expertise, honed through years of competition at Daytona and Talladega, made him one of the most formidable competitors at these events. The crash incidents throughout Yarborough's career deserve examination not as isolated events, but as evidence of the physical courage that defined his competitive character. Stock car racing in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s was a dangerous occupation, and the drivers who competed during those decades accepted a level of risk that would be considered unacceptable by modern standards. Yarborough's crashes, some of them spectacular and some of them frightening, were part of the bargain that every driver of his era accepted, the price of competing at the limits of adhesion and speed in cars that offered limited protection. His response to the crashes was always the same. He assessed his injuries, climbed from the car, and asked when the next race was. The routine was not bravado. It was the genuine expression of a competitive mentality that could not conceive of allowing a crash to interfere with the pursuit of the next victory. The toughness was real, a product of the same willpower that had carried him from the tobacco fields of Timmonsville to the victory lanes of the Cup Series, and it was the quality that, more than any other, earned him the respect of his peers. The respect that Yarborough earned from his competitors was a form of tribute that no award or induction could match. The men who raced against him, who saw him at his best and at his most aggressive, who felt the force of his competitive presence on the track and in the garage, universally acknowledged that Cale Yarborough was among the toughest and most determined drivers they had ever encountered. Richard Petty, whose own toughness and competitive longevity were legendary, recognized in Yarborough a kindred spirit, a man whose love of competition and refusal to accept defeat mirrored his own. David Pearson, the most technically gifted driver of the era, acknowledged that racing against Yarborough required a level of intensity and alertness that he did not need to maintain against most other competitors. Bobby Allison, whose 84 victories testified to his own extraordinary competitive abilities, said that Yarborough was among the hardest men to beat in any form of competition. These assessments, offered by men who were themselves among the greatest drivers in the history of the sport, are the ultimate validation of Yarborough's competitive character. When the best say that a man was among the best, the statement carries a weight that no statistical analysis can match. And the best said it about Cale Yarborough, consistently and without reservation, throughout his career and after it. The transition into team ownership that Yarborough undertook in the later years of his career represented an attempt to extend his involvement in the sport beyond his driving days. Yarborough fielded Cup Series cars for a period in the late 1980s and early 1990s, attempting to apply the competitive principles that had guided his driving career to the management of a racing operation. the team produced modest results, never achieving the level of success that Yarborough had experienced as a driver, and the venture eventually concluded without the championships or the sustained competitiveness that Yarborough had hoped to achieve. The relative lack of success in team ownership was, in retrospect, unsurprising. The skills that make a great driver are not the same skills that make a great team owner. Driving is an individual pursuit, a contest between one man and the machine and the track and the other drivers. Team ownership is an organizational pursuit, requiring the management of people, resources, relationships, and processes that are vastly more complex than the demands of piloting a race car. Yarborough's genius was in the cockpit, not in the boardroom, and his post-driving career reflected the reality that excellence in one domain does not automatically translate to excellence in another. The later years, spent in South Carolina, were characterized by a quietness that contrasted with the intensity of the competitive years. Yarborough returned to the rhythms of his rural upbringing, tending to business interests that included farming and automotive ventures, maintaining his connections to the racing community through occasional appearances and through the relationships that decades of competition had created. He was active in the community that had raised him, contributing to the civic and charitable life of Timminsville and the surrounding area with the same commitment he had brought to his racing career. The health challenges that accompanied Yarborough's later years were a reminder of the physical toll that 3 decades of stock car racing exacts on the human body. The crashes, the heat exposure, the vibration, the G-forces, the constant physical stress of wrestling heavy, unforgiving machines around oval tracks at high speeds, all of these factors accumulated over the course of a long career and left their mark. Yarborough faced these challenges with the same toughness and the same refusal to complain that had characterized his entire life, dealing with the physical consequences of his career with a stoicism that was entirely consistent with his character. The statistical comparison between Yarborough's three-peat and other dominant runs in the sport's history provides additional context for the achievement. During the 3 championship seasons of 1976 through 1978, Yarborough won approximately 31% of the races he entered, a winning percentage that is among the highest sustained over a multi-year period in the sport's history. The percentage is even more impressive when viewed in the context of the era, when fields of 30 to 40 competitive cars made winning a significantly more difficult proposition than it might appear from the raw numbers. The head-to-head record against his principal rivals during the championship years illustrates the breadth of Yarborough's dominance. Against Richard Petty, the King, Yarborough produced a winning record during the three-peat that reversed the historical dynamic between the two men. Against David Pearson, who was widely regarded as the most naturally talented driver of the era, Yarborough held his own in direct competition and outperformed him consistently in the championship standings. Against Bobby Allison, whose own career was producing victories at a remarkable rate, Yarborough maintained an edge in the critical moments that determined championship outcomes. The ability to outperform all 3 of these drivers simultaneously across 3 consecutive seasons is the most telling evidence of Yarborough's dominance. Each of his principal rivals was, individually, a driver of extraordinary ability. Petty had won more races than anyone in history. Pearson was considered the most skilled behind the wheel. Allison was among the most versatile and most determined competitors the sport had ever seen. To beat all 3 of them consistently over the course of 90 races was an achievement that required not just speed or talent, but a comprehensive competitive superiority that encompassed every dimension of the sport. The race at Daytona in February of 1977, Yarborough's second Daytona 500 victory, was a microcosm of the qualities that defined his championship run. The race was a battle between the sport's biggest names, with Petty, Pearson, Allison, and a dozen other competitive drivers vying for the win. Yarborough, running Johnson's car with the confidence that comes from being the reigning champion, positioned himself at the front of the field through a combination of speed, strategy, and the aerodynamic advantage that Johnson's preparation had provided. When the green flag dropped for the final restart, Yarborough was where he always was in the critical moments at the front, in position to control the outcome. He held off the challenges of the other frontrunners through the closing laps, using the draft and his own aggressive driving to maintain the lead. When the checkered flag fell, Yarborough had added another Daytona 500 victory to his growing collection, confirming his status as the dominant driver in the sport and providing the emotional launchpad for the second championship season. The road course dimension of Yarborough's career, while less celebrated than his oval track achievements, was another indicator of his comprehensive competitive abilities. The Cup Series schedule during Yarborough's era included a small number of road course events, races that were conducted on courses that included left and right turns, and that demanded a driving style fundamentally different from the oval racing that constituted the majority of the calendar. Yarborough's willingness to compete on road courses and his ability to produce competitive results at these events demonstrated that his skills were not limited to a single type of racing, but extended across the full range of competitive formats that the sport presented. The Riverside Road Course, located in Southern California, was the primary road course venue on the schedule during Yarborough's championship years. The track was a challenging facility that rewarded precision, braking ability, and the capacity to manage the car's weight transfer through a variety of corner configurations. Yarborough's performances at Riverside were competitive enough to contribute meaningfully to his championship point totals, ensuring that the road course events did not become a liability in the season-long battle for the title. The versatility that Yarborough demonstrated across the full range of Cup Series tracks is one of the most impressive aspects of his career. Many drivers of his era specialized in one type of track, dominating the superspeedways or the short tracks or the intermediate ovals, while struggling at venues that demanded a different set of skills. Yarborough's ability to compete effectively everywhere, to adapt his driving style and his competitive approach to the specific demands of each venue, was a reflection of the comprehensive nature of his talent and the depth of his competitive preparation. The ceremonial events and the public appearances that accompanied Yarborough's career added another dimension to the demands placed on him. As a three-time champion and one of the sport's most prominent figures, Yarborough was expected to participate in a wide range of promotional, charitable, and ceremonial activities that consumed time and energy beyond the racing itself. The sponsor obligations, the media interviews, the fan appearances, and the various events that the sport organized to promote itself and its participants were all part of the champion's responsibilities, and managing these demands while maintaining competitive focus was a challenge that required organizational skills and personal discipline. Yarborough handled these demands with a straightforwardness that was consistent with his character. He was not a natural self-promoter, preferring to let his racing speak for itself rather than cultivating a public image through media appearances and promotional activities. But he understood that the demands were part of the bargain, that the sponsors and the fans who supported the sport expected certain things from its champions, and he met those expectations with the same determination and the same reliability that he brought to the racetrack. The economic impact of Yarborough's career on the sport extended beyond his personal earnings and his team's competitive results. The 3 consecutive championships and the media attention they generated contributed to the sport's growing national profile during a critical period of its development. The championships demonstrated that NASCAR could produce sustained competitive narratives that rivaled those of any other professional sport, and the storyline of Yarborough's three-peat provided the kind of multi-year drama that attracts and retains fans. The commercial value of the championships was also significant. Sponsors who associated their brands with the Yarborough-Johnson team during the championship years received exposure and credibility that enhanced the value of their investment. The success of these sponsorship relationships demonstrated to other potential sponsors that NASCAR offered a viable and effective marketing platform, encouraging the influx of corporate investment that would eventually transform the sport's economic structure. The 1978 season the final year of the three-peat, deserves particular attention because it represented the fullest expression of the Yarborough-Johnson partnership's capabilities. The 10 victories that Yarborough produced that season were distributed across a range of tracks and conditions that demonstrated the comprehensive nature of the team's competitive superiority. Wins at superspeedways, short tracks, and intermediate ovals confirmed that the team was not dependent on any single type of venue for its success, and the consistency of the top 5 and top 10 finishes that accompanied the victories ensured that the championship point total was built on a foundation that was broad and sturdy. The psychological dimension of the third consecutive championship was particularly significant. The pressure of attempting a three-peat, of carrying the expectations that 2 consecutive championships had created, of knowing that the entire sport was watching and waiting for the streak to end, was immense. Every race became a referendum on the team's continued excellence. Every poor finish generated speculation about whether the dominance was fading. Every mechanical failure raised questions about whether the team's equipment was being pushed beyond its limits. The ability to perform at championship level under this scrutiny, to maintain focus and competitive intensity while managing the psychological burden of the streak, was a testament to Yarborough's mental strength and to the stability of the partnership that supported him. The celebration of the third consecutive championship was more emotional than the previous 2, reflecting the recognition that what had been achieved was extraordinary and unlikely to be repeated. 3 consecutive championships. No driver in the history of the sport had accomplished this. The achievement placed Yarborough in a category by himself, a solitary figure at the pinnacle of a sport that had been producing champions for 3 decades, but that had never produced a champion quite like him. The aftermath of the three-peat was a period of adjustment for both Yarborough and the sport. The standard that the 3 consecutive championships had established was one that no team or driver would match for nearly 3 decades. The sport moved on, producing new champions and new narratives, but the three-peat remained the benchmark against which all subsequent dominant runs were measured. Waltrip's championships in the early 1980s, Earnhardt's 7 championships over 2 decades, Gordon's 4 championships in the late 1990s, Johnson's 5 consecutive championships in the late 2000s. Each of these achievements was impressive in its own right, but each was also evaluated in relation to the standard that Yarborough had established during the 3 greatest seasons of his career. The IndyCar adventure of 1966, while brief, reveals a dimension of Yarborough's character that is sometimes overlooked. The Indianapolis 500 was at the time the most prestigious single race in American motorsport, and Yarborough's decision to enter it demonstrated a competitive ambition that extended beyond the boundaries of stock car racing. He wanted to test himself against the best open-wheel racers in the world, to prove that his talent was universal rather than specific to any single form of racing. The experience at Indianapolis was humbling. The open-wheel cars were fundamentally different from the stock cars that Yarborough had spent his career driving. They were lighter, more responsive, and more aerodynamically sensitive, requiring a driving style that was significantly different from the muscular, physical approach that oval stock car racing demanded. Yarborough qualified for the race, an achievement in itself for a driver without significant open-wheel experience, but he was unable to compete for the victory, and the adventure served primarily as a reminder that even the greatest competitors must respect the specific demands of their chosen discipline. But the willingness to try, the willingness to risk failure on the national stage in pursuit of a challenge that extended beyond his comfort zone, was entirely consistent with Yarborough's character. The man who had wrestled alligators and played football against larger opponents and snuck into race cars as a teenager was not a man who shied away from unfamiliar challenges. The Indianapolis adventure was, in this sense, a footnote to a larger story, the story of a man who approached every challenge with the same absolute conviction that he could overcome it through will and effort. The deeper truth about Cale Yarborough is that his greatest competition was never against Richard Petty, or David Pearson, or Bobby Allison. His greatest competition was against the world's assumption that he was not enough. Not big enough, not wealthy enough, not polished enough, not connected enough, not anything enough. The boy from Timmonsville, South Carolina, the son of a tobacco farmer, the runt of the litter in a sport that valued size and strength and swagger, spent his entire career proving that the world's measurements were wrong, that the thing that matters most in competition is not what you have but what you refuse to surrender. Let that sink in. Cale Yarborough was 5 feet 7 inches tall, 150 pounds. In a sport where the physical demands of wrestling a 3,500-pound stock car through 4 hours of competition at speeds exceeding 150 miles per hour were immense, where the heat in the cockpit exceeded 130 degrees, where the steering was unassisted and the braking was manual, and every lap was a physical battle between the driver and the machine, this small man from the low country of South Carolina dominated, not just competed, dominated. 3 consecutive championships, 83 victories. A career that stretched from the late 1950s to the late 1980s, encompassing 3 decades of the most intense and most dangerous competition in American motorsport. But here is what makes this unforgettable. The source of that dominance was not physical, or rather, it was not only physical. Yarborough was strong for his size, remarkably so, the product of a childhood spent doing hard manual labour on a tobacco farm and an adulthood spent maintaining a fitness regimen that was ahead of its time. But there were drivers in the field who were stronger, who were taller, who had more natural physical advantages for the task of piloting a stock car. What they did not have, what none of them had in the same measure, was Yarborough's will. The will was the thing, the absolute, unconditional, non-negotiable refusal to accept defeat. It was not the same as desire, which every professional athlete possesses to some degree. Desire can be satisfied, will cannot. Desire is a wanting, will is a commanding. Yarborough did not want to win. He demanded it, of himself and of the world, with an intensity that was almost frightening in its totality. The demand did not soften in the face of adversity. It intensified. The worse the situation, the more Yarborough poured into it, as if the act of overcoming the obstacle was more important to him than the prize that lay on the other side. This quality, this implacable will, is the thread that connects every aspect of Yarborough's story. The childhood on the tobacco farm, where the work was hard and the margins were thin, and the only way to survive was to outwork the land and the weather and the economics of a crop that offered no guarantees. The early racing career, when the equipment was inferior and the results were disappointing, and the temptation to quit was ever present. The partnership with Jimmie Johnson, which succeeded because both men shared the same refusal to accept limitations. The 3 consecutive championships, which were won not just with talent and speed, but with a stamina and a persistence that wore down the competition over the course of 3 full seasons. The cost of this will was real, and it was paid not just by Yarborough, but by the people closest to him. Betty Jo Yarborough spent decades married to a man whose primary relationship was with the racetrack, a man who gave the best of his energy and his focus to the pursuit of speed and the accumulation of victories. The marriage endured, which is itself a testament to the strength of the bond between them and to Betty Jo's willingness to accept the demands that the racing life placed on their partnership. But the endurance of the marriage should not obscure the sacrifices it required. The missed moments, the absent holidays, the constant anxiety of being married to a man who put his life at risk every weekend from February to November. The children grew up with a father who was a legend in his sport, but who was also, necessarily, a part-time presence in their daily lives. The racing schedule of the 1970s demanded extended absences, weeks spent on the road, travelling from track to track, and the time available for family life was limited by the relentless demands of competition. Yarborough was, by the standards of his era, a devoted family man, but the standards of the era were shaped by a culture that placed professional achievement above almost everything else, and the compromises that this prioritization required were borne primarily by the family members who stayed behind. Let that sink in. The 3 consecutive championships that define Cale Yarborough's legacy were not free. They were purchased with time, with attention, with the energy and the focus that might otherwise have been directed toward the relationships and the experiences that constitute a full and balanced life. The price was paid willingly, because Yarborough understood the bargain and accepted it. But the price was real, and any honest accounting of the championship legacy must acknowledge it. The competitive mentality that drove Yarborough to his championships also produced behaviours that were sometimes controversial, and that occasionally crossed the line between aggressive racing and unsportsmanlike conduct. The bumping incidents, the post-race confrontations, the willingness to use the car as a weapon when he felt he had been wronged, these were aspects of Yarborough's competitive character that his critics pointed to as evidence of a win-at-all-costs mentality that went beyond what the sport's code of conduct should permit. The criticism was not entirely unfounded. Yarborough was aggressive to a degree that sometimes shaded into recklessness, and there were occasions when his driving endangered not just himself, but the drivers around him. The 1979 Daytona 500 incident, regardless of where one assigns the blame for the initial crash, demonstrated a willingness to resort to physical confrontation that was inconsistent with the standards of sportsmanship that most professional athletes are expected to maintain. But the criticism must be balanced against the context. Stock car racing in the 1970s was a physical, confrontational sport that tolerated, and in some cases celebrated, a level of aggression that would be considered unacceptable in the modern era. The culture of the garage expected drivers to stand up for themselves, to retaliate against perceived slights, and to demonstrate through their actions that they were not to be trifled with. Yarborough was a product of this culture, and his behaviour on and off the track reflected its values. To judge him by the standards of a later era is to apply a framework that did not exist during the years when his character was formed and his career was built. The philosophical dimension of Yarborough's career is one that deserves more attention than it typically receives. Yarborough was not a reflective man in the way that some athletes are reflective, given to extended ruminations on the meaning of competition and the nature of excellence. He was a man of action, of deed rather than word, whose understanding of the world was expressed through his performance behind the wheel rather than through his pronouncements off the track. But the career itself, viewed as a whole, expresses a philosophy that is as coherent and as compelling as any that has been articulated in the literature of sport. The philosophy is simple. The world does not owe you anything. It does not care about your size, your background, your resources, or your expectations. It cares about what you do, and what you do is determined not by the circumstances that surround you, but by the will that resides within you. If you want something badly enough, and if you are willing to work for it with an intensity that admits no compromise and no retreat, then the world will eventually yield. Not because it is fair, not because it is just, but because the human will, when it is fully engaged and fully committed, is the most powerful force in the universe. This philosophy, never articulated by Yarborough in these terms but expressed in every race he ran and every championship he won, is the deepest truth of his career. It is a philosophy that speaks to something universal in the human experience, the desire to overcome limitations, to prove the doubters wrong, to transform disadvantage into advantage through the sheer, relentless application of effort and will. It is a philosophy that resonates far beyond the world of stock car racing, because the struggle it describes is not the exclusive property of athletes, but is the common inheritance of every human being who has ever been told that they are not enough. The community of Timmonsville, South Carolina, has honoured Yarborough's legacy through the years, recognizing the native son who put their small town on the map and who carried its values and its spirit with him through a career that made him famous across the country and around the world. The recognition is deserved because the connection between Yarborough and Timmonsville was not just a matter of geography, it was a matter of character. The toughness, the self-reliance, the refusal to quit. These were qualities that Yarborough learned on the tobacco farms and the dirt roads of the PD region, and they were the qualities that carried him to greatness. The passing of Cale Yarborough on December the 29th, 2023, at the age of 84, marked the end of a life that had been lived with an intensity and a determination that few have matched. The tributes that followed his death came from across the racing world and beyond, from drivers and team owners and fans who recognized that the sport had lost one of its most important and most distinctive figures. The tributes acknowledged the championships and the victories, but they also acknowledged the character of the man, the toughness, the competitiveness, and the absolute refusal to accept any outcome other than the one he intended. The story of Cale Yarborough's life and career is the story of what the human will can accomplish when it is fully committed. It is not a story of natural advantage or inherited privilege. It is a story of a small boy from a small town who looked at the world and decided that its limitations did not apply to him. That decision, made in the tobacco fields of South Carolina and affirmed on the racetracks of America for 3 decades, is the most important thing about Cale Yarborough. It is the thing that made him a champion, the thing that made him unforgettable, and the thing that makes his story, even now, a source of inspiration for anyone who has ever been told that they are too small, too poor, too ordinary, too anything, to achieve the extraordinary. The broader cultural significance of Yarborough's career extends beyond the racing community. His story is an American story in the most fundamental sense, a narrative of individual achievement against the odds that resonates with the core mythology of the American experience. The self-made man, the underdog who rises through determination and effort to the pinnacle of his profession, is one of the enduring archetypes of American culture, and Yarborough's life embodies that archetype with a completeness that few other lives can match. The significance is enhanced by the specific nature of the arena in which the achievement occurred. Stock car racing, more than any other major American sport, is rooted in the working-class, rural culture of the American South. The fans who fill the grandstands, the men and women who work in the garages and the shops, the communities that host the tracks and that organize their social lives around the racing calendar are overwhelmingly drawn from the same demographic that produced Yarborough himself. His success was their success, a validation of the values and the way of life that they shared with him, and the bond between Yarborough and the fans who supported him was a bond of class and culture as much as a bond of sporting allegiance. The contrast between Yarborough's era and the modern era of the sport illuminates the magnitude of his achievements. Modern Cup Series drivers benefit from power steering, climate-controlled cockpits, sophisticated data acquisition systems, computer-modeled car setups, purpose-built pit crews that train like Olympic athletes, and safety equipment that is designed to protect against the most severe impacts. The drivers of Yarborough's era had none of these advantages. They drove with manual steering, in cockpits that exceeded 130 degrees, with minimal data beyond what they could feel through the seat and the steering wheel, with pit crews that were composed of mechanics who also served as the team's fabricators and engineers, and with safety equipment that would be considered grossly inadequate by modern standards. The recognition that Yarborough achieved his 3 consecutive championships under these conditions adds an additional dimension of respect to an achievement that was already extraordinary. He did not merely win 3 straight championships, he won 3 straight championships under conditions that were more physically demanding, more dangerous, and more technically challenging than anything modern drivers experience. The comparison is not intended to diminish the achievements of modern champions, who face their own set of challenges and demands. It is intended to ensure that Yarborough's achievements are understood in their proper context, and that the magnitude of what he accomplished is not diminished by the passage of time or the evolution of the sport. The mentoring relationships that Yarborough maintained throughout his career, both as a recipient and as a provider of guidance, were an important dimension of his impact on the sport. As a young driver, Yarborough benefited from the advice and the example of older, more experienced competitors who helped him develop the skills and the knowledge necessary to compete at the highest level. As an established champion, He provided the same kind of guidance to younger drivers, sharing the wisdom that decades of competition had provided, and offering the encouragement that young drivers need during the difficult early stages of their careers. The personal faith that sustained Yarborough through the ups and downs of his career was an important element of his inner life, providing a framework of meaning and purpose that extended beyond the competitive arena. His faith was a private matter, not something he spoke about at length in public, but those who knew him well understood that it was a source of strength and comfort that supported him through the challenges of a life spent in the pursuit of speed and the constant proximity of danger. Betty Jo Yarborough's role in the story deserves recognition beyond the brief mentions that racing biographies typically afford to the wives of champion drivers. Betty Jo was not merely a supportive spouse. She was a partner in the fullest sense of the word, a woman who managed the family's affairs with a competence and a dedication that allowed her husband to pursue his career with the focus and the intensity that championship-level competition demanded. The marriage endured for more than 60 years, a testament to the depth of the bond between them and to the sacrifices that both partners made in service of a shared life. The children and the grandchildren who carry the Yarborough name forward are the living legacy of a life that was extraordinary in its achievements and its commitments. The family that Cale and Betty Jo built, grounded in the values of their South Carolina upbringing, and enriched by the experiences of a career that took them across the country and into the national spotlight, is a legacy that exists independently of the trophies and the records, and that endures in the daily life of a family that carries within it the DNA of a champion. The deeper truth about Cale Yarborough, the truth that underlies all of the statistics and the stories and the cultural analysis, is that he proved something that is easy to state and difficult to believe. He proved that the human will, when it is fully engaged and fully committed, can overcome any obstacle. Not some obstacles, not most obstacles, any obstacle, size, poverty, obscurity. The limitations that the world imposes on those it considers ordinary, the limits of the human body, the limits of the machine, the limits of the track. Yarborough confronted every one of these obstacles during his career, and he overcame every one of them through the same method, the same irresistible force of will that carried him from the tobacco fields of Timmonsville to the winner's circle at Daytona and beyond. The question of where Cale Yarborough ranks in the all-time hierarchy of stock car racing is one that generates honest debate among the sport's historians and its fans. The statistical case is strong. 83 victories places him fourth on the all-time wins list. The 3 consecutive championships are matched, in terms of consecutive titles, only by Jimmie Johnson's 5-peat. The 4 Daytona 500 victories are tied for the second most all-time. By the cold metrics of the record book, Yarborough belongs in the first tier of the sport's all-time greats, alongside Petty, Pearson, Earnhardt, Gordon, and Johnson. The case becomes even stronger when the context of the achievement is considered. Yarborough's championships were won in an era when the physical demands of racing were greater, the safety protections were fewer, and the competitive field was as deep as the sport has ever produced. The comparison with later champions is complicated by the vast differences in technology, safety equipment, and competitive structure that separate the eras, but even allowing for these differences, the magnitude of Yarborough's achievement is undeniable. The argument against placing Yarborough at the very top of the all-time rankings typically centers on the number of his career victories, which, while impressive, falls short of the totals accumulated by Petty and Pearson, and which trails the career totals of several later drivers. But this argument must be tempered by the recognition that Yarborough reduced his Cup Series schedule in the 1980s, running fewer races per season, and therefore accumulating fewer opportunities for victories. Had he maintained a full-time schedule throughout his career, his victory total would almost certainly have been significantly higher. The character dimension of Yarborough's legacy is perhaps the most enduring and the most universally appreciated. In a sport that has produced its share of larger-than-life personalities, Yarborough's character stands out for its consistency, its authenticity, and its unwavering commitment to the values that defined his upbringing. He was tough, He was honest. He was competitive to a degree that bordered on the pathological. And he was, in every setting and every circumstance, exactly who he appeared to be, without pretense, without calculation, and without the image management that characterizes so much of modern professional sport. The enduring connection between Yarborough and the South Carolina community that raised him was one of the most genuine and most touching aspects of his post-racing life. He never left, despite the wealth and the fame that his career had provided, despite the opportunities that would have been available to him in the larger cities and the more glamorous locations that attract most retired professional athletes. Yarborough stayed in the place where he had grown up, maintaining his connection to the land and the people that had shaped him. The decision to stay was not a default, it was a choice, a deliberate affirmation of the values and the way of life that had made him who he was. The final years of Cale Yarborough's life were spent in the quiet of the South Carolina Low Country, surrounded by the family he had built and the community that had always supported him. The racing world had moved on, as it always does, producing new champions and new stories and new rivalries that captured the attention of the fans and the media. But for those who remembered the three-peat years, who remembered the ferocity and the determination and the absolute refusal to be beaten, the name Cale Yarborough continued to evoke a response that was part admiration, part awe, and part gratitude for the example of a life lived without compromise. The competitive legacy that Yarborough left to subsequent generations of drivers extends beyond the statistical record. His championship run established a standard of excellence and a competitive template that influenced the drivers and the teams that followed him. The principle that championships are won through sustained consistency rather than occasional brilliance. The principle that physical conditioning is a competitive advantage. The principle that the partnership between driver and team owner is the fundamental unit of competition. These were principles that Yarborough's career demonstrated with particular clarity, and that subsequent champions have continued to apply. The comparison with modern champions is illuminating. Jimmie Johnson's 5 consecutive championships, won between 2006 and 2010, surpass Yarborough's three-peat in terms of sheer duration, and Johnson's total of 7 championships ties Richard Petty and Dale Earnhardt for the most in the sport's history. But the comparison is complicated by the vast differences in the competitive environments of the two eras. Johnson competed in cars with power steering, air conditioning, and sophisticated safety equipment. He had access to simulation tools, data acquisition systems, and engineering resources that Yarborough could not have imagined. The physical demands of modern racing, while still significant, are substantially less extreme than the demands of Yarborough's era. This is not to diminish Johnson's achievements, which are extraordinary by any standard. It is simply to note that comparisons across eras must account for the differences in conditions, and that Yarborough's three-peat, achieved under conditions that were more physically demanding, more dangerous, and less technologically supported than anything modern drivers experience, deserves to be evaluated on its own terms and within its own context. The legacy of toughness that Yarborough established is one that the sport has increasingly moved away from, as the professionalization and the corporatization of NASCAR have produced a culture that values polish and markability alongside competitive excellence. The modern Cup Series driver is expected to be media-savvy, sponsor-friendly, and image-conscious in ways that would have been foreign to Yarborough and his contemporaries. The emphasis on toughness and physical courage, while still present, has been supplemented by an emphasis on communication skills, brand management, and public relations that reflects the sport's evolution into a mainstream entertainment enterprise. This evolution is neither good nor bad. It is simply the natural progression of a sport that has grown from a regional pursuit into a national enterprise. And the values that characterized the earlier era have been supplemented rather than replaced by the values of the new one. But the example of Cale Yarborough, the man who won 3 consecutive championships through talent, will, and physical courage, remains a benchmark against which the sport's champions are measured, a reminder of what the sport was at its most raw and its most demanding. The legacy of the Yarborough-Johnson partnership is one of the great collaborative achievements in the history of American sport. The partnership demonstrated that the alignment of a brilliant strategist with a fearless competitor can produce results that exceed what either individual could achieve alone. Johnson provided the cars, the strategy, and the engineering genius. Yarborough provided the driving talent, the competitive intensity, and the physical courage. Together, they produced 3 consecutive championships that remain among the most impressive achievements in the history of the sport. The relationship between Yarborough and the land that raised him is one of the most grounded and most authentic aspects of his personal story. The tobacco farms of the PD region were not just the setting of his childhood. They were the crucible that formed his character, the environment that taught him the lessons of hard work and self-reliance that he carried with him throughout his life. The connection to the land was real, physical, and enduring, expressed through Yarborough's continued involvement in agricultural pursuits, even after his racing career had made him a wealthy man. The farming was not a hobby for Yarborough. It was a vocation, a calling that connected him to the rhythms of the natural world and to the traditions of his family. The work was hard, as farm work always is, but it was also grounding, providing a counterweight to the intensity and the glamour of the racing world. The contrast between the two pursuits, the quiet, repetitive work of tending crops and the explosive, adrenaline-fueled work of piloting a stock car, was a reflection of the dual nature of Yarborough's character, the man who was both a farmer and a champion, both a son of the soil and a master of speed. The tribute to Betty Jo that ran through Yarborough's later public statements acknowledged a truth that all champions' families understand, but that the public rarely fully appreciates. The championships belong to the family as much as they belong to the driver. The sacrifices are shared, the anxiety is shared, the pride is shared, and the credit, when it is distributed honestly, extends far beyond the man who held the steering wheel to the woman who held the family together while he was away chasing the checkered flag. The Yarborough name, in the decades since his retirement, has maintained its place in the racing lexicon as a synonym for toughness and for the sheer irresistible force of competitive will. When a driver is described as having the Yarborough mentality, it means something specific and something admirable. It means that the driver approaches the competition with an intensity and a refusal to accept defeat that goes beyond what normal competitive drive can explain. It means that the driver will push beyond the limits that more cautious competitors respect. It means that the driver will not quit, will not yield, will not accept any outcome other than the one he intends to achieve. The Yarborough mentality is the highest compliment that can be paid to a competitor in stock car racing, and its continued use, decades after the man it describes last competed, is a testament to the enduring power of his example. What does Cale Yarborough's legacy mean to the sport of NASCAR today? The question requires a careful answer, because the legacy has been, in some respects, underappreciated by a generation of fans whose primary exposure to the sport came after the peak of Yarborough's career. The modern NASCAR fan, raised on the rivalries of Earnhardt and Gordon and the dominance of Jimmie Johnson, may know Yarborough's name without fully understanding the magnitude of what he accomplished. The 3 consecutive championships have been somewhat obscured by the passage of time, overshadowed by later achievements that were produced in a different era with different rules and different levels of media coverage. This historical underappreciation is itself a kind of injustice. The 3 consecutive championships of 1976 through 1978 remain one of the 2 or 3 most impressive achievements in the history of the sport. Only Jimmie Johnson's 5 consecutive championships, won between 2006 and 2010, surpass the streak in terms of sheer duration, and the comparison between the 2 runs is complicated by the vast differences in the eras in which they were achieved. Yarborough's championships were won in cars with no power steering and no air conditioning, on tracks with minimal safety infrastructure, against a field that included some of the most talented drivers the sport has ever produced. The achievement demands respect, and the passage of time should enhance rather than diminish that respect. The cultural context of the Yarborough legacy is inseparable from the broader context of the era in which he competed. The 1970s were a period of transition for NASCAR, a decade in which the sport began its gradual transformation from a regional, southern-based enterprise into a national phenomenon. Yarborough's championships were won during this transitional period, at a time when the sport was still finding its national identity, and when the drivers who competed were still, in many respects, the inheritors of the moonshine running, dirt track culture that had given the sport its origins. Yarborough was one of the last champions of the old guard, the generation of drivers who had come up through the dirt tracks and the short tracks of the South, and who carried with them the values and the customs of the world that had produced them. He was tough in the way that the old guard was tough, physically imposing despite his small stature, emotionally stoic, and committed to a code of conduct that valued self-reliance and competitive intensity above all other virtues. The champions who followed him, Darrell Waltrip and Dale Earnhardt and Jeff Gordon and Jimmie Johnson, represented a different era and a different set of values, shaped by the expanding reach of television, the growing influence of corporate sponsorship, and the professionalization of the sport's organizational structure. The Yarborough legacy is, in this sense, a bridge between two eras. He was the last champion to be produced entirely by the old culture, the culture of dirt tracks and farm fields and men who raced because it was in their blood. And he was, through the visibility that the 3 consecutive championships and the 1979 Daytona fight provided, one of the figures who helped the sport transition to the new culture, the culture of national television and corporate sponsors and carefully managed public images. The partnership with Jimmie Johnson, which produced the 3 championships, is itself a legacy that deserves recognition. Johnson, the former moonshine runner, who became one of the most successful team owners in the history of the sport, found in Yarborough the perfect driver for his cars and his philosophy. The partnership demonstrated that the combination of a brilliant team owner and a fearless driver could produce results that transcended the limitations of the individual components, and it established a model for the driver-owner relationship that subsequent generations of teams would attempt to replicate. The physical legacy of Yarborough's career, the 83 victories, and the 4 Daytona 500 wins, and the 3 championships, is permanent, embedded in the record books in numbers that will endure for as long as the sport exists. But the physical legacy, impressive as it is, does not capture the full significance of what Yarborough meant to the sport. The full significance is found in the character of the man, in the toughness and the determination and the absolute refusal to accept defeat that defined every aspect of his competitive life. The character legacy is the one that endures most powerfully because it speaks to something that transcends the specific achievements of any particular career. The message of Yarborough's life, that a small man from a small town can become a champion through the application of will and effort and courage, is a message that resonates across eras and across sports and across the full range of human endeavour. It is a message that does not require knowledge of stock car racing to appreciate. It requires only the recognition that the human capacity for achievement is limited not by circumstances, but by the strength of the commitment to overcome them. The death of Cale Yarborough in December of 2023 brought a renewed appreciation for his career and his legacy. The tributes that followed his passing came from across the racing community and from the broader world of sport, acknowledging not just the competitive achievements, but the character of the man who had achieved them. Richard Petty, his great rival, spoke of Yarborough with respect and affection. Other drivers and team owners who had known Yarborough during his racing years added their own memories and their own assessments, building a collective portrait of a man who was universally respected for his toughness, his talent, and his competitive integrity. The racing world that Cale Yarborough helped build has changed enormously since the years of his greatest achievements. The cars are safer, the tracks are more sophisticated, the budgets are larger, the television coverage is more comprehensive, The sport has become a global enterprise that bears only a passing resemblance to the regional pursuit that Yarborough entered as a young man in the 1950s. But the essential character of the sport, the emphasis on courage and determination, and the willingness to push the limits of what is possible, remains unchanged. And that character owes a debt to Cale Yarborough, the small man with the enormous will, who showed the sport and the world what a human being can accomplish when the refusal to quit is absolute. The connection between Yarborough and the fans who watched him race during his championship years was built on a recognition that went beyond the statistics. The fans saw in Yarborough a man who embodied the values they held most dear: toughness, self-reliance, and the refusal to be intimidated by anyone or anything. He was not the most charismatic driver of his era, not the most media-friendly or the most commercially polished. He was, instead, the most authentic, a man whose on-track persona and off-track personality were perfectly aligned, who did not perform a version of himself for the cameras, but who was, in every setting and every circumstance, exactly who he appeared to be. That authenticity is a legacy in itself. In a sport that has become increasingly image-conscious and commercially driven, the example of a man who succeeded by being exactly who he was, without pretense or calculation, is a reminder of what the sport can be at its best. Not a corporate entertainment product, not a carefully managed brand experience, but a contest between human beings who are willing to risk everything, including their lives, in the pursuit of a goal that matters to them more than anything else in the world. In the end, the story of Cale Yarborough is a story about will. Not talent, though he had that. Not luck, though he had his share. Not resources or connections, or the advantages that smooth the path for those who are born into them. Will. The raw, unpolished, unbreakable will of a small man from a small town who decided, at some point in his youth, that the circumstances of his birth would not determine the trajectory of his life. That decision, made in the tobacco fields of Timmonsville, South Carolina, was the foundation on which everything else was built. The 83 victories, the 4 Daytona 500 wins, the 3 consecutive championships that remain among the most remarkable achievements in the history of American motorsport. 3 consecutive championships. The phrase has been repeated throughout this story because it deserves to be repeated. It deserves to be repeated because the achievement it describes is so extraordinary that repetition is necessary to ensure that its magnitude is fully absorbed. In a sport, a single championship is the culmination of a lifetime's work for most drivers, where the margin between winning and losing is measured in fractions of a second and fractions of an inch, where mechanical failure or a single crash can unravel an entire season's worth of effort. Cale Yarborough maintained championship-caliber performance for 3 consecutive seasons. 28 victories, 90 races, tens of thousands of competitive miles, 3 years of sustained excellence that have only one parallel in the sport's 75-year history. The man who accomplished this was not a physical giant. He was not a beneficiary of family wealth or family connections. He was not a product of a racing academy or a corporate development program. He was the son of a tobacco farmer from the low country of South Carolina, a boy who grew up working the land with his hands and who carried the calluses and the toughness of that upbringing into the cockpit of a stock car, where they became the foundation of a career that placed him among the immortals of his sport. The world told Cale Yarborough that he was too small. He won 3 championships. The world told him that he was too poor. He won 83 races. The world told him that he was too old. He won Daytona 500s in his 40s. The world told him again and again in every way it could that he was not enough. And Cale Yarborough, with the quiet, stubborn, absolutely unyielding determination that was the signature of his character, told the world that it was wrong. He told it with his driving, with his toughness, with his willingness to push a stock car to its absolute limits and to hold it there, lap after lap, race after race, season after season, until the limitations that the world had imposed on him were revealed to be illusions, constructs of a conventional wisdom that had no authority over a man who refused to submit to it. The engines are quiet now. The tracks that witnessed Yarborough's greatest triumphs still host races, but the cars are different, the drivers are different, and the era that produced the 3 consecutive championships is a memory accessible only through the record books and the recollections of those who lived through it. The South Carolina Lowcountry, where Yarborough grew up, still grows tobacco, but the farms are fewer and the world they sustained has changed in ways that would be unrecognizable to the boy who left Timminsville to pursue a dream of speed. But the will remains. It remains in the record books, where the 3 consecutive championships stand as monuments to human determination. It remains in the stories that the old-timers tell, the stories of the small man who fought bigger men and faster men and beat them through the sheer irresistible force of his refusal to lose. It remains in the values that the sport was built on, the toughness and the self-reliance and the competitive fire that Yarborough embodied more fully than perhaps any other driver in the sport's history. Cale Yarborough, 83 victories, 4 Daytona 500 wins, 3 consecutive Cup Series championships. The toughest man who ever climbed into a stock car, they called him Cale, and the name, spoken with respect by the men who raced against him and with reverence by the fans who watched him race, carries within it the full weight of a life lived without compromise, without apology, and without the slightest trace of doubt that the small man from the small town could do what the whole world said he could not do. He did it, and the world which had been so certain of his limitations had nothing left to say.